High on the shoulder of a Colorado mountain, a bruised purple stain spread across the northern sky, while the wind fell into a silence that felt far worse than any storm. In the finest house in the valley below, frost crept up the inside of a parlor wall, growing while a man fed oak after oak into a cast-iron stove that could not hold the cold at bay. His wife pulled their two small daughters deeper into a nest of quilts, her breath pluming white in a room that was supposed to be the safest in the whole territory. 60 feet inside the frozen mountain, a widow in a clay-stained apron pressed her bare palm flat against solid granite, and the rock was warm. Her two children slept nearby in their shirt sleeves, untroubled, as though the killing winter outside did not exist. The whole town had called her mad for digging into that hole, had laughed at her dead husband's folly, and turned away. Now the first hard pellets of snow began to hiss against the world, and the storm came down to prove which of them had understood the mountain. Somewhere in the white fury, a figure was already fighting his way up the trail toward her door. There are two kinds of cold in the high country, and by the autumn of 1884, Verena Marsh had learned to tell them apart the way a sailor learns to read weather in the color of a morning sky. The first kind was honest. It nipped at the knuckles and reddened the cheeks and made a body glad to be alive. Glad for the smell of wood smoke and the ache of a warm hearth waiting at the end of a hard walk. The second kind was different. It did not bite. It seeped. It found the seams in a house, the way water finds the low place in a field, and it settled into the timber, into the crumbling chinking, into the marrow of whoever slept beneath the roof, and it made a single promise so quiet that most people never heard it until it was too late to matter. You will not see the spring. For most in the Colorado Rockies, that promise was a threat, a thing to bar the door against and pray away. For Verena, standing on a sagging porch above the town of Bounty Hollow, with her two small children asleep behind her, that promise was not a threat at all. It was arithmetic. It was a certainty as plain as the frost, already whitening the aspen at the tree line a full month before it had any right to. And the strange thing, the thing she could not yet begin to know, was that the answer to that killing cold lay not in building a thicker wall against it, not in stacking more cordwood or nailing more green pine over the gaps in the logs, but in something no soul in the valley would have believed if she had spoken it aloud on the church steps. The answer lay 60 feet down, in the dark heart of the mountain her dead husband had loved better than his own safety. The pity came first before the snow, before the wind found its full and terrible voice. It arrived in baskets, loaves of bread already gone dry at the edges, jars of preserves boiled thin because the good fruit had been kept back for paying households, a twist of tallow candles, a folded blanket worn to gauze at its center. The women of Bounty Hollow carried these small mercies up the switchback trail with their faces arranged into that particular softness people wear for the doomed, and they set them on her table, and they did not quite meet her eyes. They meant well. Verena never once doubted that they meant well, and that was the cruelest part of it, because you cannot be angry at kindness without becoming something ugly, and so she swallowed it instead. But kindness offered to a woman the whole town has already buried in its mind carries a particular weight, and each basket pressed down on her chest like a smooth river stone, laid there while she slept. She would smooth her apron and thank them in a voice she kept level by main force, and she would watch them pick their way back down the slope, with their skirts gathered against the brush, plainly relieved to be leaving, and she would understand exactly what she had become in their eyes. She was a tragedy the town had agreed upon in advance, a slow accident they were all waiting to happen, so that afterward they might shake their heads over their own warm suppers and say they had seen it coming. Poor thing, they had said so all along. Her husband had been a man who read the earth, the way other men read scripture, with reverence and a private certainty that the truth was written there for anyone patient enough to learn the language. Emmett Marsh had come up into these mountains years before with a battered leather satchel of instruments and a conviction that the ground beneath a man's boots held more honest truth than anything set down in a printed book. and he had spent the better part of a decade proving it to no one's profit but the deep and constant pleasure of his own curiosity. He saw the world in layers. Where the millmen looked at a hillside and saw only so many board feet of timber, Emmett saw the slow, folded patience of stone laid down across 10,000 years, the faults and the intrusions, the secret places where water had once run scalding hot beneath the crust and left its signature behind in the mineral of the rock. That vision had never once turned itself into money. It had turned instead into a modest square of land, high on the shoulder of the range, a fine wide view of the valley, a creek that ran clear and cold over polished stones, and a cabin that could only ever be described, charitably, as hopeful. The logs had been green-felled and had begun their long, slow shrinking, almost the very day they were raised, opening thin mouths to the weather, and the chinking that her son liked to worry loose with a thumbnail crumbled a little more with every hard freeze. In the spring, the same mountain that Emmett had studied so tenderly had answered all his devotion with an indifferent shrug, a slide of loosened rock, high on a slope he was crossing, and he had simply not come home. He left behind a deed to the land, a crate of journals bound in cracked and softened leather. A boy of 7 named Silas, who had gone quiet in the months since, in a way that frightened her far more than any tantrum could have. A girl of 4 named Pearl, who mirrored back whatever sorrow she caught on her mother's face. And a coming winter that the oldest men in the valley had already begun to speak of in low and careful voices, the way men speak of a thing they hope will not overhear its own name. The signs of it were scattered everywhere for anyone who had the eyes to read them. The aspens had turned gold and let their leaves go before the first day of September. The squirrels had grown frantic and greedy, their caches spilling over with far more than any winter of ordinary length could ever demand of them. The wind that came sliding down off the high peaks carried a serrated edge even at midday, and the light itself had begun to slant thin and mean through the pines, as though the sun had already half given up on the country. Nature was making her preparations early and in earnest, and nature does not trouble herself to lie about such matters. The town's answer to the widow's predicament was unanimous, and it was delivered, as most of the town's important pronouncements were, by Cyrus Bellwether. He owned the sawmill at the bottom of the gulch, and he had raised, board by careful board, nearly every proper structure standing in Bounty Hollow, and his certainty about the world had the density and the grain of the seasoned oak he milled. He climbed to her porch one gray afternoon in a wool coat that had cost more than everything she owned put together, and he did not once look at her face as he spoke. He looked instead at the roofline, at the poor joinery of the corners, at the visible sag in the ridgepole, with the pained and slightly disgusted expression of a craftsman forced to stand in the presence of shoddy work. "You have to come down off this mountain, missus," he told her, hooking his thumbs behind his lapels in the manner of a man accustomed to being heated. "That cabin will not hold through a hard frost. Never mind through what the whole valley can feel coming. There is a mineral concern out of Denver that will pay you a fair enough figure for the timber rights and the claim together. Take their money. There is honest work to be had at the boarding house laundry, and a warm, dry room in the bargain. It is the only sensible course open to a woman in your position, and I would be doing you no kindness at all to stand here and pretend otherwise." He was not a cruel man. That was the terrible heart of it. He was not wrong either, and Verena knew with a sick certainty that he was not wrong, which was somehow far worse than any cruelty could ever have been. The cabin was a coffin, waiting only for someone to fit the lid. Any reasonable woman in the territory would have signed the paper he offered, and packed the children's few things into a trunk, and gone down to the steam and the endless clatter of washing other people's linen, and would have counted herself fortunate for the roof. But selling the land felt to her like lowering Emmett into the cold ground a second time, deeper now, past any hope of ever reaching him again. His presence still lingered in every corner of the place. It lingered in the smooth creek stones he had lined the path with of an evening, in the exact and careful angle at which he had set the single pane of glass in the window. so that it caught the very first of the morning sun. In the crate of journals, she had not yet found the courage even to open. Pity, she was learning in those long gray days, is a blanket that smothers the very will it means to comfort. She thanked Bellwether for the trouble of his climb. She watched his broad back descend the trail. Then she went inside, and she wept for 2 full days, while the wind practiced its scales in the gaps of the walls. And Silas grew quieter still. And Small Pearl pressed her wet face into her mother's skirts, and cried because her mother was crying, and for no reason she could have named. On the third morning she stopped. The weeping had scoured something out of her from the inside, and what remained in the swept and hollowed place it left behind was not hope exactly, but a hard and level resolve, clean as the floor of an empty room with the light coming across it. She would not become the ward of anyone's charity. She would not raise Emmett's children in the wet heat of a laundry, under the sidelong pity she could already feel gathering at the bottom of the hill. She would not sell the last place on the whole earth that still held the warm shape of her husband's hands. That night, once the children were asleep beneath every blanket the poor house could muster between them, she dragged the heavy crate over to the lamp, and she lifted the lid, and she let the smell of old leather and pencil, lead and her husband's own hands, rise up out of it to meet her in the dark. The first journals on top were the working record of a geologist, dense with terms she did not know and diagrams she could not begin to follow. Fine cross-sections of the whole range drawn in a patient and loving hand that made her throat close to look at. She turned those pages slowly, brushing the paper with her fingertips as though she were somehow touching him through it. But beneath the working books lay another kind, older, the leather gone soft and dark with generations of handling. And when she opened in the topmost of these, the writing changed entirely. These were not Emmett's own surveys at all. They were his careful transcriptions, copied out in evenings she now remembered watching, without ever once understanding what she was seeing, of a set of far older journals that had been kept by his grandfather, an old stone worker who had raised hearths in the cold country back east, long before Emmett was born. And the old man's subject was not ore, and it was not fault lines. His subject, page after yellowed page, was heat. She read of hearths that were not iron at all but stone, great banked masses of brick and rock into which a man might burn a single bright armful of wood for one hot hour, only to have the thing give that gathered warmth back to him, slow and steady and faithful, for a full day, and a night after the last flame had died to gray ash. She read of homes cut back into the sheltering sides of hills, of families who had learned to lean their houses against the deep and unchanging warmth of the ground itself, rather than stand out in the open and fight the killing air with kindling and prayer. The old man had written of the earth not as a dead thing to be drilled and quarried and hauled away, but as something very nearly alive, patient and enormous and slow, holding within its vast body a low furnace that never once guttered, no matter how the wind might scream across the surface of the world above. One line she read 3 times over, until it seemed to have been set down on the page for her alone across all the long years between his hand and her eyes. A man who fights the winter will lose, the old script read, but the one who befriends the mountain need never be cold again. She lifted her eyes slowly from the page. The lamp guttered in a draught. The wind pressed its shoulder against the wall, and her gaze fell, almost by accident, on a folded map at the very bottom of the crate, drawn in Emmett's own careful pencil, a map of their own small square of land on the mountain. It showed the cabin and the creek and the familiar stand of aspens she knew by heart. But on the far northern edge of the property, in a rough shoulder of rock she had scarcely any reason ever to walk out to, he had inked a small and careful X, and beside it a notation in the private shorthand of his trade. Prospect Tunnel 60 feet, barren of ore. And then, added later in a different and softer pencil, pressed harder into the paper as though his hand had moved with a sudden excitement, 3 words underlined twice. Warmth and Rock. She knew the place at once. Everyone in Bounty Hollow knew the place, and everyone in Bounty Hollow laughed at it over their suppers. They called it Emmett's Folly. The hole in the mountain where the fool geologist had spent the better part of a month digging by his own hand after some phantom seam of nothing, chasing a fortune that had never been there to find, before he abandoned it at last as the plain failure it so obviously was. It was a scar on the clean face of the hillside, a monument in the shape of a hole to one dead man's foolish dreaming, and Verena Marsh sat very still in the guttering lamplight, with that folded map open across her knees, and she felt, for the first time since the terrible spring, the smallest possible ember of something that was not grief. She did not sleep at all that night. When the first pale gray of dawn touched the highest peaks, she wrapped herself against the cold, took up the good lantern and a spare handful of candle stubs, and left her sleeping children with the door barred and a whispered promise to be back before ever they woke. The trail out to the north shoulder was choked with a whole summer's growth of thorny brush and half blocked by a fall of loosened rock, and she spent the better part of an hour hauling stone aside and tearing at the brambles with her bare and bleeding hands until she had opened a gap just wide enough to squeeze her body through. The lantern light found the throat of the tunnel, a black low mouth breathing out cold and metallic air, and she drew one steadying breath of her own and went in. The passage was narrow, a rough tube of blasted rock, scarcely wide enough for a man to have pushed a laden barrow through it, and within only a few steps the sound of the wind outside simply ceased, cut off clean, as though a heavy door had swung shut on the entire world. The silence that rushed in to replace it was total and pressing, broken only by the rasp of her own breath and the scuff of her boot soles over loose rubble. The lantern threw great jumping shapes across walls that glittered here and there with veins of quartz and bright flecks of mica, and she went forward with care, one hand always trailing along the cold stone, counting off her paces without ever deciding to. 10 feet, 20, and somewhere past that second count she noticed a thing so strange that her steps faltered and stopped. The air around her was no longer cold. It had softened to something merely cool, the mild and even coolness of a root cellar in high summer. 30 feet in, and the chill had gone out of it altogether. 40, and she could no longer see the plume of her own breath hanging in the lantern light. 50. The dark ahead of her was warmer now than the doorway of a heated house on a mild spring evening, and her heart had begun to strike hard and quick against her ribs. At 60 feet, the tunnel ended in a solid, unbroken face of granite, and she stood before it with the lantern raised high in a hand that had begun to tremble, and she laid her bare palm flat against the rock. It was not warm the way a stone left out in the summer sun is warm, a borrowed and fading heat that gives itself up and is gone. It was warm from somewhere deep within itself, a deep and patient and living heat that seemed to press gently back against her hand, that seemed to seep up through the very skin of her palm into the small bones of her wrist, steady and slow as a sleeping heartbeat, wholly indifferent to the season, wholly indifferent to the wind she knew must be howling somewhere far above, through the cold world she had left behind at the tunnel mouth. She pressed both her hands flat to it. She leaned her forehead against the granite and closed her eyes, and there in the perfect dark and the perfect silence at the heart of the mountain, she understood at last what her husband had found in this place and died before he could ever tell her. Somewhere behind that face of stone, deep in the folded and secret rock, there ran the ghost of an old hot spring, one of the 100 hidden veins of warmth that laced all through these mountains where the earth had once run molten and had never entirely cooled, and it warmed the granite from the inside. And it had done so for longer than there had been men in the valley to wonder at it, and it would go on doing so, long after they were all of them gone. Emmett had not been chasing gold in this hole in the ground. He had been chasing this. He had found the one thing in all the cold country that could carry his family through. And then the mountain had taken him before he could carry the news of it home, and the whole laughing town had buried the knowledge along with him under the name of a dead fool's folly, the stone of pity that had sat lodged in her chest for 3 long months, that no basket of dry bread had ever once lightened, that no soft and sorrowful word had ever managed to shift, was simply gone. In the place where it had been there was now something else, something that frightened her badly with the sheer size of it. They would not spend this winter in the cabin, waiting to freeze while the town below waited to grieve. They would not go down to the laundry and the sidelong looks. They would come here. They would go down into the mountain, into the one warm place in all the frozen country, and they would let the patient earth itself keep them alive the way the old stone worker had written across the years that a family could be kept. She crawled back out into a morning gone bright and merciless with cold, her hands raw and torn, her skirts filthy with rock dust and clay, and she stood blinking at a hard blue sky that had no notion at all of what had just happened to her down in the dark. And she said the words aloud to no one but the wind, tasting on her tongue how mad and how utterly right they sounded together. "We are not going to fight it," she said. "We are going to invite it in." She told the children that same morning because she had resolved she would never keep her fears or her plans hidden from them behind a soft face, the way the whole town kept its judgment hidden behind soft faces. And Silas listened to her with the grave and total attention of a boy who had privately decided sometime in the spring that he was the man of the house now, whether anyone had thought to ask him or not. He did not laugh. He asked her, in his careful and serious way, whether the mountain would mind them coming in, and she told him truthfully that she believed the mountain had been waiting a very long time for someone to ask it properly, and at that something in his small, tight shoulders eased for the first time in months. Pearl only wanted to know whether there would be bread in the new place, and Verena promised her that there would be bread, and she meant the promise with her whole heart, though she had, at that moment, not the faintest earthly idea of how she would ever manage to keep it. The labor that followed those quiet promises was the hardest of her whole life, and she began it that very afternoon. Because winter in the high country does not wait politely for a woman to feel ready. First, the tunnel itself had to be cleared. Every foot of its length swept of the loose rubble that littered the floor. Every barrowload of broken rock hauled out into the thin daylight and dumped down the slope, until her arms shook uncontrollably by the third trip, and her back had become a single sustained ache by the 20th. Silas worked at her side through all of it without being asked even once, carrying stones that were too large for him, clutched two-handed against his narrow chest, his jaw set in a small hard line that she recognized with a pang as the very mirror of her own. She widened the low mouth of the passage until a grown person could walk in without stooping. She studied the old journals by lamplight late into each night, until her tired eyes swam and crossed on the page, learning by heart the shape of the thing she meant to build, and she came to understand that the living space would have to be made here. In a chamber, she would widen some 40 feet in, where the walls first turned warm to the touch, close enough to the granite face to borrow the deep heat of the buried spring, but far enough back to keep the smoke and the cooking well clear of where the children would sleep. She needed a floor before anything else. The old writing was firm and unyielding on the point, insisting that bare damp rock would forever sweat and chill and rot the health of anyone who slept above it, and that any proper hearth demanded first a foundation laid dry and true. She spent days down at the creek in water, so cold, it numbed her clean to the elbow, within minutes, choosing out flat and sound stones and carrying them up the slope, one and two at a painful time, building beneath them a deep bed of clean gravel, through which the wet could drain away and be gone. She salvaged warped gray planks from a sluice box that had collapsed years before, and she laid a rough dry platform over the stone for the children to sit and to sleep upon. And then she began the work that turned the town's easy pity, at long last, into something a good deal meaner. She dug a shallow pit near the tunnel mouth and mixed clay dug from the creek bank with sand and dry chopped grass, treading the whole cold mess with her own bare feet in the way the old journal described. And she raised a small crude kiln of the first misshapen bricks she managed to make. And then she began to fire more of them in earnest. The bricks came out of it warped and uneven, no two of them alike as brothers, but they came out hard, and hard was the only quality she needed of them. From the valley below, The men of the mill watched her hauling stone up the mountain, morning after morning, and understood it, at first, as a grieving widow shoring up the foundation of her doomed cabin, a sad and futile labor, and they nodded to one another over it. With the grim and comfortable approval men, reserved for the properly and safely hopeless. But then the smoke of her brick kiln began to rise steadily from the north shoulder, day after day after day, and the woman who was supposed to be quietly packing her trunk to leave was instead firing brick, hundreds upon hundreds of hard brick. And the approving nods soured slowly into frowns, and the frowns curdled into whispers, and the whispers carried on the wind a single word she could hear even from the top of her mountain. Mad. The Marsh widow had gone clean mad up there. In her grief, they told one another. She was digging out her own grave and firing the very stones to seal herself and her babies inside it. Let them, Verena thought, treading the cold, wet clay with the frost stinging her bare ankles, watching another smudge of her own smoke climb into a hard and cloudless blue sky. Let them say every word of it. A grave and a home are built from the very same stone, she told herself as she worked, and only the living are ever left to say which of the two a body is made. The fired bricks rose in uneven stacks beside the tunnel mouth. Her hands cracked open and bled, and healed over rough and hard. And still, for all of it, the true labor of the thing had not yet even begun. The heart of the whole design, the entire reason for the stone floor and the fired brick and the aching months of it, was the hearth. Not a hearth as the warm parlors of Bounty Hollow understood that homely word. Not a squat black box of iron throwing its heat wastefully into a room for a single hour before the greedy cold crept back in to reclaim it. What the old journals described in their patient diagrams was something nearer to a living creature, a great banked mass of brick and mortared stone, as tall as a standing man, and half again as wide, its whole body honeycombed inside with a long and winding maze of narrow passages, built for the sole purpose of seizing hold of the smoke and hot gas of one quick fierce fire, and refusing flatly to let it go, wringing every last thread of warmth out of it before at last, permitting it to escape up and out of the mountain. She would raise the thing at the very back of the widened chamber, set hard against the warm granite face itself, so that the borrowed heat of the buried spring and the stored heat of her own fires would join together in the stone and hold. She began to lay it up brick by uneven brick, each one mortared home with the same trodden clay, and it rose slowly out of the tunnel floor, hulking and strange and primitive, nothing at all like the neat cast-iron elegance in the parlors below. A rough and ancient thing, an idol of mud and stone, taking shape in the belly of the mountain. She had raised it to perhaps the height of her own waist, kneeling in the close lamplight, with both her hands sheathed to the wrist, in drying gray clay, when the understanding came over her cold and sudden that she had made an error somewhere that she did not know how to undo. The smoke would have to leave the chamber somehow. A simple pipe punched straight up through the rock overhead would carry all her precious heat straight up and out along with it, wasting the very warmth she was breaking her body to save. And worse than that, the old journals warned in the plainest terms that a cold vent starves a fire of its draw, chokes the whole thing, and can fill a closed room with smoke enough to sicken a sleeping child in the dark. The vent had to be kept warm along its entire length, so that it would coax the spent smoke up and out along a steady rising current of its own heat. Emmett's map had marked a natural fissure, a crack in the granite running from somewhere near the back of his tunnel, all the way up through the body of the mountain to the open air above. She knew that if she could only find that seam and channel the throat of her hearth up into it, the whole trouble would solve itself. But she had tapped along the granite with her hammer for the better part of a whole day, listening hard as the sound changed from a dull thud to a faint hollow ring and back to dull again, and she could not for the life of her locate the crack. And the daylight at the tunnel mouth was already failing, and her hands had begun to shake too badly with cold and exhaustion to hold the chisel true. And she knelt there in the gathering dark with the half-built hearth looming over her like a question she had no answer for. And for the first time since she had laid her hand on the warm stone, she felt the cold breath of real doubt at the back of her neck. It was into that low moment that a voice came out of the tunnel mouth behind her, dry and cracked as an old and rusted hinge, and it very nearly stopped her heart in her chest. "You have laid your smoke chamber too shallow," the voice observed, without any greeting, and without a word of apology for the fright of it. "It will draw cold and spit soot back at you all the winter long. But the bones of it are right. Lord above, the bones of it are right, and I never in all my years thought to live and see the like of it built again by living hands." She spun around with the chisel raised before she had decided to raise it, and the lantern light found a man standing in the low mouth of the tunnel. He was old and spare, his beard gone the flat gray color of cold wood ash, a battered felt hat crushed in two gnarled hands that had plainly spent a long lifetime shaping and setting stone. She knew the face, in the way that one knows a face that has been long absent from any conversation that mattered. Amos Hartwell. He had been a mason once, back in the earliest days of the valley, before the millmen and their cheap, fast-milled lumber had made his slow and careful craft a thing of the past, and the town had let him drift quietly, out to its ragged edges, and then out of its memory altogether, the way a town will always do with anything it no longer finds a use for. She had not exchanged 10 words with the man in all her years on the mountain. She had assumed, on the rare occasions she thought of him at all, that he had already passed from the world unremarked. "I am not asking anyone for help," she told him. The chisel still held up in the narrow space between them, the old and bitter wariness of the mocked rising in her before she could think to stop it. "If you have climbed all the way up here to tell me I have gone mad, you can save the breath for the walk down. The town has said it plenty already, and I have heard every word." Something moved across the old man's weathered face then that took her a long moment to place, because she had not seen it aimed her way in a great while. It was not pity. It was respect, plain and unguarded, and underneath the respect ran something else that looked almost like grief. He took one slow step into the warmth of the tunnel, and he laid one weathered hand flat against the rough side of her half-built hearth, the way a man might lay a hand on the shoulder of an old and long-lost friend. And he was quiet a moment before he answered her at all. "I am not here to call you mad, Mrs.," he said at last. "I am here because I already know that you are not." His pale eyes moved over the winding courses of brick, reading them the way she had once watched her husband read the layered stone of the range. "I know exactly what this is that you are building. There is not another living soul within 100 miles of this valley who does save me, and I had near given up all hope of dying with the knowledge of it passed on to any hand at all. A hearth that banks its heat down deep in stone, instead of flinging it away up a cold pipe. My own father raised them, back east, before this whole country forgot the way of it. I have carried the making of them in these two hands for 60 years, with nowhere on God's earth to put it down." He turned from the hearth then, and he looked at her directly, and what he said next struck her a harder blow than the winter cold ever had. "But you did not find this in any book of mine, and that is the very thing that has had me standing at the bottom of your trail 3 days running, working up the nerve to climb it, because I know where it is you found it. Your husband found me first." The chisel lowered of its own accord. "Emmett," she said, and his name came out of her broken. "You knew Emmett. He came to me in the last week of his life," Amos said, and there was no cruelty at all in the way he laid it before her, only the careful gentleness of a man handing over something that might shatter. "Middle of the night, near enough. Sat himself down in my one good chair, and drank my bad coffee without a complaint, and asked me every question a living man could think to ask about the banking of heat in stone. And I answered every one of them, and I never in all my life saw a man listen the way that man listened to me. He had found something up here, he told me. Something in the rock, a warmth that did not quit with the season, and he had a notion in his head grown so big that he was near afraid of it himself. He said he had a wife and 2 little ones down below, and that he was not going to spend one more winter watching that greenwood cabin try its level best to shake them all to death. He was going to build them a home inside the mountain warm as a morning in June, and he had come to me to learn how to do the thing right. The old man's voice thickened and caught, and he looked down at his own ruined hands. He rode out of my yard that night, the happiest man I had laid eyes on in 10 years. And then the mountain took him, before ever he could set the first brick. I heard afterward they had taken to calling it a fool's hole. Emmett's folly. I heard the whole town had a good laugh over it. He lifted his eyes back to hers, and they were wet and bright in the lantern light. I could not stand another day in my cabin and let them go on laughing at the smartest and most loving thing a man ever set out to do for his family. When I saw your smoke start to rise up off this shoulder, Mrs., I knew that you had found his map, and I knew he was not going to have to leave it undone after all. Verena stood very still in the lamplight, the great unfinished hearth at her back, and the warm rock breathing softly all around her, and the last clinging shred of the town's judgment fell away from her all at once and forever, because she understood now what she had not understood in all her weeks of kneeling, alone in the dark, and doubting her own mind. She had believed all this while that she was the widow of a fool, salvaging a mad dead dream out of nothing but grief and stubbornness, because grief and stubbornness were the only things left to her to hold. She was not that at all. She was the wife of a man who had loved her so completely and so entirely that with the last free week of his one life, he had gone out alone into the cold night to learn how to keep her warm forever, and had breathed a word of it to no living soul but one forgotten old mason at the ragged edge of the world, and had died still carrying the whole of the secret in his chest before ever he could set it down for her. The folly had never once been a folly. It was the truest and the most loving thing that anyone had ever built for her in all her life, and he had trusted her, without ever knowing that he was doing it, to be the one who would find it and finish it. "Then you will show me," she said, and it was not a question, and her voice did not shake at all. "Where I have put the smoke chamber wrong, the whole of it. You will show me how he meant it to be done right." The old man set his crushed hat down on a shelf of stone with the quiet solemnity of a man hang up his coat in a house where he means to stay, and he rolled his sleeves back from forearms still corded with the muscle of a lifetime's hard work. And something came alive in his ruined face that she suspected had been dead in it a long while. "I will do a good deal better than show you," he said, lowering himself stiffly to his knees beside the hearth and running his thumb along the joint where her brick met the living granite. "I will build it with you, with these hands. I have been waiting my whole life for a fire worth the teaching, and I will be damned to the cold before I let it freeze out on me now." With the pupil finally standing in front of me, he glanced up at her, and the smallest dry ghost of a smile cracked through the ash of his beard. "The first thing you are going to learn is that the smoke has got to pay its rent. It does not get to leave this stone until it has given us up every last thing it is carrying. You have built it a straight, clear road out the door. We are going to build it a maze it can barely find its way through." They worked past the middle of the night, the two of them together, while the children slept warm on their salvaged planks against the granite that no fire had yet touched but that held its own deep, patient heat regardless. And Verena learned more of her husband's last secret in those few dark hours than she had wrung out of a whole week of squinting at his journals. She learned why the smoke chamber had to be set deep in the mass. She learned why the passages had to double back on themselves again and again and again, so that the hot gas was made to snake 40 and 50 feet through the very body of the hearth before it was ever allowed to slip free. She learned why the whole great mass would never glow searing and dangerous to the touch the way a cast iron stove glowed, but would instead grow deep and profoundly and evenly warm and stay that way. Hour upon hour upon hour, a great stone battery charged full by one bright fire and giving its charge back slow and faithful, all through the longest and blackest night. She learned the way a fire could be coaxed into telling a long, warm story to the stone, instead of shouting its whole heat out at once and losing every word of it to the wind. And she understood, watching the old man's ravaged hands move so sure and so gentle over the brick, that the proud town below had thrown away not one treasure on this mountain, but two of them, the warmth down in the rock and the knowledge alive in this forgotten man, and that her husband, in the last free week of his life, had quietly gone out and gathered up the both of them. She did not tell Amos that first night how thin their stores of food had already worn, nor how she had counted the good candles down to a single closed fist of them, nor how some frightened part of her still woke in the blackest hours of the morning, wholly certain that Bellwether had been right all along, and that she was leading her own two children down into a grave in the ground. She would learn to trust the hearth in time, the same slow way she was already learning to trust the strange old man kneeling in her firelight. But there came a moment, near the end of that first long night's labor, when Amos sat back on his heels to rest his aching knees and let his eyes travel around the widened chamber, over the rough walls and the two sleeping children, and the great dark rising shape of the hearth, and he said a thing quietly, half to himself, that she would carry with her to the end of her days. The folk down in that valley think warmth comes out of a woodpile, he said, his gaze resting on the granite face that had never once in all its ages been cold. It does not. Warmth comes up out of the ground, and out of what a good man leaves behind him when he goes, and out of whoever is left stubborn enough to dig for the both. Your Emmett knew that in his bones, and now, missus, so do you. She banked the small work fire down to coals and covered the children over against the coming chill of the morning. And she walked the old man out to the tunnel mouth, where the true and killing cold stood waiting, and they paused a moment together in the doorway between the two worlds, the murderous air on the one side and the mountain's own soft breath on the other. And neither of them said a word, because some understandings between people do not need any words at all to be sealed and made binding. Then Amos turned up his collar against the night and went out to pick his careful way down the dark trail to his own cold cabin below, promising to come again at the first gray light. And Verena stood in the warm mouth of the mountain, watching his lantern bob and shrink and finally vanish into the black. And for the first time since the spring took her husband, she was not afraid of what the morning would bring with it. Before we go on to see what that terrible winter did to the town of Bounty Hollow, and to the proud men in it who were so entirely certain they alone knew the only right way in the world to keep a family warm, I want to stop the story a moment and ask you something, because I have a feeling you already understand the answer to it a good deal better than any of those men ever did. So many of us are told, all our lives long, that there is only ever one right way to do a thing, one right way to build a house, one right way to earn a living, one right way to bury the dead and go on living afterward, one sensible course laid out plain, with everyone we know lined up to tell us exactly what it is, and a small quiet voice down inside us that whispers something different and gets shouted down every time by the loud and reasonable chorus. If you have ever heard that quiet voice in yourself, and if you have ever once found the courage to trust it against every sensible soul around you, then take just a moment right now to subscribe to this channel, because the stories we tell here are made for you above all. And tell me, down in the comments below, what is the most stubborn piece of so-called common sense you have ever had to defy in your own life to do the thing you knew, deep in your bones, was the right one? I would truly love to read it. Because Verena Marsh was about to defy the very coldest winter this country had seen in 100 years, armed with nothing more than a dead man's underlined map, a forgotten old man's ruined hands, and the deep, unaccountable warmth of a rock the whole valley had already agreed could not possibly exist. And the storm, when at last it came down screaming off the high peaks, was going to settle once and for all which of them had truly understood the mountain. The days that followed fell into a rhythm shaped entirely by the falling of the light, and the light was failing faster now with every turn of the calendar. Amos came up the trail at the first gray of each dawn and stayed until the dark drove him home again, and under his patient hands the hearth stopped being a widow's desperate guess and became instead a thing built true to a law far older than the town below it. He showed her how to find the fissure that Emmett's map had promised, not by tapping blind at the rock, but by lighting a single candle and watching close to see where its flame leaned and guttered, reading the faint draw of moving air the way a tracker reads a single bent blade of grass. When they found it at last, a hairline seam running up into the dark that a person might have walked past 1,000 times over without ever once seeing, the old man wept a little and pretended gruffly that it was only the rock dust in his eyes. They cut the throat of the hearth up into that seam by lamplight over long days, the hardest and most patient labor of the whole undertaking. Every single stroke of the chisel, a small act of pure faith made in the cramped and silent dark. And when it was finished at last, and they lit a small test fire of dry pine to check the draw of it, the smoke rose up sweet and eager into the warm stone throat, without a single gray wisp of it spilling back into the room. Verena laughed out loud at the sight, a bright startled sound she had not made since the spring. And Silas came running from his play to see what had so delighted his mother. And even little Pearl clapped her small hands together at a joke she was far too young to understand. Word of what she was doing up on the mountain had long since curdled down in the valley, from soft pity into something the town found a great deal easier to carry. It is a hard thing, after all, to go on feeling sorry for a woman who flatly refuses to lie down and be pitied. And so the good people of Bounty Hollow had traded their sorrow for the far more comfortable warmth of being scandalized. The Marsh widow was dragging her own babies down into a wet black hole in the ground to live like animals in a den. They said to one another over their good iron stoves in their tight-sealed houses, and old Hartwell, who everyone had long since supposed was 3/4 of the way into his own grave, had plainly lost what few wits he had left and taken up with her madness for company. That the two of them were seen hauling brick and stone up the north shoulder together, day after day, only proved to the town how far gone the pair of them truly were. Because everyone had always known, that you kept the killing winter out with good tight walls and a roaring hot fire, and that you most certainly did not go burrowing down into the frozen ground like a marmot and call the hole a home. The certainty of it in the valley was total and untroubled. It was the inherited certainty of every soul in the place, handed down from father to son, and never once held up to the light and questioned. And it carried all the settled weight of gospel. And it was about to be tested against a cold that did not care in the very least what any living soul in Bounty Hollow felt certain of. Verena felt the doubt press in, on her hardest in the gray and lonely hour just before each dawn, when Amos had not yet come up the trail, and the children still slept, and the wind moaned low through the tunnel, mouth she had not yet fully learned to trust with their lives. In those hours, the whole town's judgment seemed to gather itself at the mouth of the mountain and lean its full weight in upon her, and she would lie awake, going over and over the cold arithmetic of it. The food that would not stretch past January, the last fist of candles, the single bright and awful certainty that had been in Bellwether's voice when he stood on her porch and told her plainly she was leading her children to a frozen grave. But then the first true light would touch the high peaks, and Amos's lantern would appear faithful as a sworn promise at the bottom of the trail, and she would rise and stir the banked coals in the growing hearth and feel the great stone give her back its stored and patient warmth, and the doubt would loosen its cold grip on her throat a little more. She was learning something in those hard, lonely dawns that no soul in the comfortable town below had ever once had cause to learn. She was learning that the loudest voice in any room is not always the one that carries the truth, and that a warmth you cannot see with your eyes is not at all the same thing as a warmth that is not truly there, and that the patient ground beneath a grieving woman's feet can hold within it more real mercy than the whole warm chorus of her well-meaning neighbor's good advice. She did not yet know that a man far to the north was watching a glass barometer fall past anything in all his long experience. She did not yet know that the early gold of the aspens and the frantic greed of the squirrels had been telling the plain truth all along, nor how vast and terrible that truth was soon to prove. She knew only that the hearth was rising true, that the old man's hands grew steadier, and his pale eyes brighter with every day of purpose that the work gave back to him. That Silas had begun to smile again as he carried his stones. That Pearl had stopped mirroring sorrow, because there was less and less of it now left in her mother's face to mirror. She knew that against every sensible soul in all of Bounty Hollow, against the pity and the mockery and the settled gospel certainty of the one and only right way, she had chosen to place her whole faith in a dead man's underlined words and a forgotten craftsman's ruined hands and the deep and unaccountable heat of the living rock. And high on the shoulder of the mountain, as the light failed early, on a strangely windless afternoon, and the sky over the peaks began to take on a deep and bruised purple-gray color she had never in her life seen before, a color that the old man beside her went suddenly and utterly silent at the sight of. Verena Marsh set the final brick into the crown of the finished hearth, and she pressed her clay-cracked palm flat against its warm, rough side, and she spoke to her husband's finished work, and to the mountain, and to the vast and gathering thing on the northern horizon, the only words that seemed to matter now. "Come on, then," she said softly, watching that stain of bruise spread and deepen across the whole northern sky. "Let us see whose story the stone remembers." The bruise on the northern sky did not break the way weather ordinarily breaks in the mountains. It did not roll in on a rising wind, or announce itself with the slow gray massing of clouds that a person can stand and watch, come on and make ready against. It came down instead first as a color, and then as a silence, the deep purple-gray light flattening out across the whole valley until the entire world took on the dull dead sheen of hammered pewter, and the wind that had moaned steadily in the tunnel mouth for weeks now simply stopped all at once, as though the mountain itself had drawn one long, slow breath and was holding it deep in its chest. Amos went very still at the sight of that unnatural stillness. He had lived through more hard winters in this country than Verena had years on the earth, and she watched the last of the color drain out of his weathered face as he stood in the mouth of the tunnel and read that flat and silent sky the way another man might read a telegram bearing the very worst of news. "Get the children back into the deep chamber," he told her, and there was no room left for argument anywhere in his voice. Only a flat and total urgency that frightened her far more than any amount of shouting could have. "Now, missus, and carry in every last stick of dry wood we have got stacked out here, every splinter of it, because once this thing comes down on us, we will not be fetching any more of it, not for however many days it decides to sit on this valley and take what it can." She did not stop to ask him what he meant by it. She had learned across these weeks to trust the old man's reading of the mountain the way she had learned to trust the warmth in the deep rock, and she caught Pearl up onto her hip and took Silas firmly by the hand and moved them both back past the great finished hearth into the widened chamber against the granite, while Amos hauled armload after armload of the split pine they had stacked near the entrance deeper into the tunnel where no blowing snow could ever reach it. They worked without wasting breath on words, the two of them together in a race against a clock that neither of them could see the face of, and they had barely carried in the last of the dry wood when the first of the storm arrived. It came not as falling flakes, but as a sudden hiss, a hard vertical fall of tiny frozen pellets that struck the frozen ground with a sound like fistfuls of sand flung hard against glass. And within the space of only a few caught breaths, the whole long view down the valley was simply gone, wiped out and erased behind a churning solid wall of white that swallowed the tree line, the switchback trail, the failing daylight itself. Then the long-held breath of the mountain released all at once, and the wind came back. But it did not come back as the moaning thing it had been for weeks. It came back as a scream. It was a solid physical force that Verena felt through the very soles of her boots even 60 feet deep inside the rock, a shriek of moving air that tore and clawed at the mouth of the tunnel and hurled the hard snow past it sideways in ropes and sheets and streamers. And she understood without needing anyone to tell her that this was the very thing the early aspens had tried to warn of a month too soon. the thing the frantic squirrels had buried their food against, the thing the oldest men in the whole valley had been so plainly afraid even to name aloud. I have seen bad ones, Amos said, standing back from the tunnel mouth with his ash-gray beard, whipping in the wind that reached even that far in, watching the white fury blot out the whole of the world he had known for 60 years. I have never once seen the like of this. This is not a storm come to pass through the country and move on. This is one come to sit a while and take whatever it can get its hands on. He turned back into the warmth, and the low firelight caught the grim hard set of his mouth. Everything alive in this valley tonight that is not already dug in deep is in the fight of its life, missus. And there is a good many souls down in that town who dug themselves in exactly wrong. Verena thought then of the town below her, of the tight-sealed pine houses and the hot iron stoves glowing in their parlors, of the flat certainty in every single voice that had told her the only way on earth to keep the winter out was good tight walls and a roaring fire well fed. And for one uncharitable moment, a hard, bright satisfaction rose up in her that she was ashamed of. Even in the very instant of feeling it, she smothered it at once. Whatever the town had said of her behind its soft faces, there were children down there in it too, and mothers and old people who had done her no harm. And the storm outside did not care in the least who had been right, and who had been wrong about the building of a hearth. She turned instead to her own two children, to Silas watching the tunnel mouth with wide and solemn eyes, and to Pearl already growing sleepy and heavy-lidded in the deep, even warmth. And she made her voice go light and easy, because a mother's calm is the very first roof that a frightened child shelters underneath. Just listen to that old wind out there, wanting so badly to come in, she told them, settling Pearl gently down onto the warm planks. It can want all it likes for all the good it will do. The mountain is not going to let it past us. She fed the great hearth then, in the way that Amos had taught her, not stuffing it full and frightened the way a scared person stuffs an iron stove, but building one quick, bright, fierce fire and letting it burn hot and clean and fast, and she watched the smoke draw sweet and eager up the warm stone throat and away into the fissure, and she felt the enormous mass of the thing begin to drink down the heat and hold it deep. Within the hour, the fire had burned itself down to a low bed of red coals, and she let it, and the hearth did not cool at all. It stayed warm to the flat of her hand, and then it grew warmer still as the stored heat worked its slow way outward through all the brick, and the whole chamber settled by degrees into a deep and even warmth that had nothing frantic anywhere in it, nothing that had to be fed and fed and fed against the cold. A warmth that simply was, the plain way that the warmth of a living body simply is. Outside the mountain, the scream of the wind rose and rose again without end. Inside it, 60 feet down in the dark, Pearl slept soundly, and Silas dozed warm against his mother's side, and the patient stone remembered its one fire and gave it slowly and faithfully back. Far down the mountain, in the finest and best-built house in all of Bounty Hollow, Cyrus Bellwether was losing a battle that he did not yet even understand he had entered. He had raised the house himself, every joint of it cut true, every board tonged and grooved and set tight against its neighbor, and the great cast iron stove in the parlor glowed a deep cherry red with a belly, full of the best seasoned oak in the whole valley. By every measure the man had ever trusted in all his life, the house ought to have stood a warm fortress against any cold the winter sky could throw down at it. But the heat that poured off the roaring iron seemed to die in the air, mere inches from its own surface, swallowed whole by an air that only grew colder the farther it traveled from the stove. And the windows that had been clear glass that morning were by nightfall thick opaque sheets of crystalline ice, frozen hard from the inside out, and the tight-built walls he had raised with his own certain hands were cold to the touch and drinking the warmth straight back out of the room as fast as ever the burning oak could make it. He could feel the drafts now, and they were not the gentle wandering currents of an ordinary hard winter, but something crueler, cutting streams of Arctic air that found their way in under the doors and up through the floorboards, no matter how he stuffed the gaps with rags, And for every cubic foot of warm air his roaring stove sent, climbing up to leak away through the roofline, another full cubic foot of killing cold was pulled in from below to take its place. His wife Adele had moved the two girls to the far side of the parlor, away from the windows, where the cold pressed in hardest, and she had built them a deep nest of every quilt and every coat the house owned between its walls. And still their small breath plumed white in the air of the room, and still Adele's eyes, above the piled blankets, held a fear that she was working very hard to keep entirely out of her voice. "There is frost forming on the inside wall, Cyrus," she told him low, pitching it beneath the girl's hearing. "By the china cabinet there, growing while I stand and watch it grow. It is only the wind finding some seam I have missed." He wrenched open the iron door of the stove and shoved another split length of oak in on top of the fire, and the flames leapt up bright and useless. "I will find it, and I will stop it up." But he would not find it, because it was not a seam, and some cold part of Cyrus Bellwether had already begun to understand that terrible fact even as his hands kept busy with the fire. It was the house itself. It was the whole proud principle upon which he had built every house in the valley, failing him all at once in a cold it had never in its design been meant to face, and the knowing of it sat in his chest like a swallowed stone that no fire could ever warm. He fed the flames, he stuffed the singing drafts with rag after rag. He watched the frost climb steadily up the inside of his own parlor wall in the house that was supposed to be the safest and the soundest in all the valley. And outside the walls, the wind screamed on, tireless and patient and utterly without any mercy in it at all. The storm did not slacken with the coming of the morning. If anything at all, it deepened, the churning white wall pressing now so close and so solid against the tunnel mouth that Amos would not let Silas go anywhere near it. And the little light that came filtering down the passage was a strange and shadowless blue dimness, sifted through the feet of snow that had drifted across the entrance in the night. Verena woke to find the old man already crouched low by the hearth, feeding it its single careful morning fire, and she understood at once from the tight economy of his movements that he was thinking hard about the woodpile, about exactly how many such fires it still held within it, about just how long a siege this was going to prove to be. "How many days?" she asked him quietly, kneeling down beside him, keeping her voice low so as not to wake the children into the question. "Can't rightly say." He watched the flames take hold of the dry pine. "2, if we are truly blessed. 4, if we are not. It could be more than that." He glanced sidelong at her, and there was something almost like an apology in it. "We have wood enough for the 4, if we burn it careful the way I have shown you, and not one stick more free than that. It is the food I would fret over, missus, if I were a fretting sort of man." She had been fretting over exactly that same thing through the long gray hours before the dawn, and hearing him name it plainly out loud steadied her rather than frightening her further. Because a danger spoken openly, between two people, is only ever half the danger it is when it sits silent and swelling in one person's chest alone. They took quiet stock of the stores together in the blue dimness while the children still slept, and it was thin, thinner than she had let herself truly count before now. A sack of flour, better than half gone already. A crock of lard. A little sack of beans, some dried apple, a small piece of salt pork, coffee worn down to the last dark dregs. Enough if the storm blew itself out in the 2 days that Amos hoped for. Enough, stretched hard and watchful, for the 4 that he feared. Not near enough for whatever might lie past that. And the both of them knew it plainly, and neither of them said one word of it aloud, because Silas had begun to stir on his warm planks, and a boy of 7 did not need to wake into the cold arithmetic of hunger. She made bread that morning because she had long ago promised Pearl there would be bread in the new place, and because a warm fresh loaf does more real good for a frightened household than any speech a body could make, and the small oven built cleverly into the side of the great hearth baked it through, and perfect in the stored heat alone, while no fresh fire burned at all, and the good smell of it filled the whole chamber, and pushed the memory of the screaming wind outside, a little further back from the door of the mind. Silas ate his portion slowly, making it last. A careful thing that no one had ever thought to teach him. A thing he had simply come to understand on his own. And the sight of her 7-year-old son quietly rationing out his own bread without being asked to put an ache in Verena's chest that was sharper than any cold. When the storm is done with us, Silas said, watching the last small bite of his bread, will they still say that we are mad, the town? Amos answered him before his mother could, and he did not soften the truth of it the way that she might have. They will say whatever it is they most need to say to keep from looking the fool, boy. That is the plain way of people, and it is best you learn it young. But there is a wide difference between the thing a body says out loud and the thing that same body knows down deep. And after a storm the likes of this one, the two of them are going to come apart in this valley, like wet paper in the rain. He tore his own bread in half and handed the larger part of it, without a word or a fuss, to Pearl, who had already finished her own and was eyeing his. You remember that, when you are grown. The loud thing a body says and the quiet thing that body truly knows are not always the same creature at all, and it is the quiet one, in the end, that runs the whole world. The second day of the storm was the day the outside world first reached its cold hand up the mountain to touch them, though it came in no shape that Verena could ever have foreseen. She had gone up to the tunnel mouth to judge the depth of the drift, piling against it, keeping herself well back from the killing air, when she saw through the churning white a dark shape that did not belong at all to the storm. A laboring form fighting its slow way up the buried trail against a wind that ought by every right to have made such a thing flatly impossible. Her first startled thought was that it was some animal, an elk perhaps driven half mad and blind by the cold. Her second thought, as the struggling shape slowly resolved itself into a man bent low over a floundering horse, was that no living soul in his right mind would be out moving in this, which meant that whoever it was had some reason far past reason to be climbing her mountain in the very teeth of the worst storm in 100 years. The horse would come no nearer than the ruin of the collapsed cabin, shying and blowing hard, and the man half fell and half climbed down out of the saddle and fought the last of the distance to the tunnel mouth on his own 2 feet. And when he stumbled at last into the blue dimness of the entrance and clawed the ice-crusted scarf down from his face, Verena did not know him at all. He was young and well-dressed beneath the snow that caked him head to foot, city clothes gone sodden and stiffening fast in the cold, and his eyes held the wide, glassy look of a man who has come a great deal nearer to freezing to death than he has the wit left to understand. Amos had come up silent behind her, and she felt the old man go tense at her shoulder in a way that had nothing at all to do with the cold coming in the door. You will be the widow Marsh, the young man managed to get out, his cracked lips barely shaping the words, each one coming slow and thick through a jaw stiff and clumsy with cold. Thank God. Thank God above there was smoke up here. I saw it rising from below, saw it climbing, when every other thing in the whole valley was buried and dark, and I thought. He swayed hard on his feet, and Verena caught him by the arm and drew him in toward the warmth despite every instinct in her that was suddenly ringing out a warning. Because a man dying of the cold is first and always a man to be saved, and only afterward a man to be questioned, whoever he might turn out to be. They sat him down close by the hearth and put warmed coffee dregs, scalding hot, into his shaking hands, and the deep warmth of the chamber went to work on him, the same way it had worked on all of them, and within the hour the glassy look had left his eyes, and the color had crept back up into his gray face. But with the returning color there came also a wariness all his own, a quick and assessing glance he sent traveling around the whole chamber that Verena liked not at all. She watched him take in the great banked hearth, the dry stored wood, her 2 children sleeping warm and easy in their shirt sleeves, the whole impossible living warmth of the place. And she saw something move and settle behind his eyes that was a very long way from simple gratitude. You are Horace Pruitt's man, Amos said. It was not a question at all. The old man had not sat himself down, and his ruined hands hung loose and ready at his sides in a way that was somehow far more watchful than any clenched fist. I have marked you down in the valley, writing the claim lines, measuring out what is not yours to measure. The young man did not trouble to deny it. Warmed now, and safe, he seemed to remember all at once that he had come up this mountain as something a good deal more than a mere beggar at the door for shelter. My name is Chase Renwick, he said, straightening a little where he sat. I do the survey and title work for the Pruitt Land and Mineral Company, and I was caught out by the storm in the honest course of my business, and I will thank you kindly for the fire and be no trouble to any of you. He said it all smoothly enough, but his eyes kept drifting back, again and again, to the granite face at the rear of the chamber, to the deep warmth that plainly had no fire anywhere near it for a source. And Verena watched him come to understand something, and watched him just as plainly decide to keep the whole of that understanding to himself. Though I will say, Mrs., I never once expected to find any living soul dwelling up here at all, let alone dwelling warm as a summer parlor. There were men down in Denver quite certain this whole claim was worthless. Barren rock, they called it. Not worth the good paper the deed was drawn on. Then the men down in Denver were wrong, Verena said, and she kept her own voice level and even. But a cold that had nothing whatever to do with the storm outside had begun to gather itself hard in the pit of her stomach, because a stranger who rode the title lines for a land company did not come climbing a mountain in a killing storm by any accident, and the smoke he claimed so gratefully to have followed up to safety had been rising plain from her hearth for weeks now in full view of the whole valley below, and she did not believe for one single moment that Chase Renwick had been caught out by any chance at all on the one and only trail in the whole county that led up to her door. He stayed the night because there was no turning any living creature back out into that storm to die. But Verena did not sleep, and she marked that Amos did not so much as close his eyes either. And the two of them kept a long, wordless watch together over the warm chamber and the stranger asleep in the heart of it, over the children, over the great hearth, whose deepest secret the young man's traveling eyes had already stripped bare. In the deep, dead middle of the night, when Renwick lay still at last and his breathing had gone slow, and even with true sleep, Amos leaned his head close to her ear. He did not follow your smoke up here to save his own skin, the old man breathed, so low that it was scarcely any sound at all in the dark. He followed it because Pruitt sent him up to find out why a claim they had already priced out as worthless had smoke coming off it all the autumn long. They know there is something up here, Mrs. They have known it longer than ever you have, and a company that will price a whole mountain worthless so as to buy it up cheap is a company that already knows full well it is sitting on a fortune. The words settled down into Verena the way the killing cold settles into a greenwood wall, patient and certain, finding out every last seam. She had believed all this while that her one hard fight was the fight against the winter, against the town's easy mockery, against her own cold doubt in the gray hours before dawn. She saw now, all at once, that there was another fight entirely that she had never once known she was in, older by far than her own arrival on the mountain, running along underneath the whole of everything, the way the hot spring ran, unseen beneath the granite, and that her dead husband's folly was not worthless barren rock at all in the cold eyes of the men who truly mattered, but a thing worth sending a man up a mountain in 100-year storm to lay a measuring tape against. She lay awake the rest of that long night with her arm thrown protective over her sleeping daughter, listening to the endless scream of the wind and to the slow breathing of the stranger by her fire. And she understood with a sinking certainty that when the storm at last broke and blew itself out, her troubles were not going to break and blow out along with it. They were only going to change their shape and come at her from a new direction. The storm broke on the third day. It did not so much end as finally exhaust itself, the great scream falling away by slow degrees through the long morning into a moan, and then at last into a strange and ringing silence, and the churning white wall thinned and parted to show a sky of hard cloudless blue and a whole world transformed into something Verena had never in her life laid eyes on. The snow lay waist-deep across the open ground and far higher than that where it had drifted. Blue shadowed in the hollows, carved and sculpted into long, smooth-flowing curves by the hand of the wind, and the silence lying over all of it was so complete and so total, after 3 full days of unending shriek, that it pressed upon the ears like a sound of its very own. Chase Renwick was gone by the time the light came up full and golden. He had dug his shivering horse out of the drift and started it, picking down the broken trail toward the valley, without so much as a single backward word of thanks. And Verena watched him go from the tunnel mouth, and knew with a cold certainty that whatever he carried back down that mountain in his head was worth a great deal more to Horace Pruitt than any honest survey he had ever ridden up to make. She had little time to stand and dwell on it, because the valley spread out below her had been broken hard by the storm, and the breaking of it was a good deal worse than she had let herself fear. From the high shoulder of the mountain, she could see the whole of the town, and even at that far distance she could read the damage in it plain, the collapsed roofs sagging and stove in under their tons of snow, the dark caved shapes of cabins broken at the corners, the too still and watchful quality of a place that had spent 3 full days and nights fighting hard for its own life. Smoke rose thin from some of the chimneys, but from a great many others there rose nothing at all, and it was that missing smoke that turned her stomach over cold, because a dead chimney after a storm the likes of this one meant a fire that had gone out in the night, and a fire gone out in a cold like this one meant a family that had burned through the very last of its wood. Amos read the broken valley at her side, and his weathered face was grim. They burned everything they had down there, chasing the heat up a cold chimney the way I told you a fool always chases it, he said quietly. The furniture, the fences, whatever would take a flame and give a moment's warmth. He shook his gray head slowly. Some of them will have come through it. Some of them will not have wood enough left this morning to boil a pot of water, and the cold is not done with this valley yet, Mrs. Not by a long road. A hard, clear sky after a storm the likes of that one means the very coldest nights are still ahead of us. It will drop tonight past anything we have felt yet. The words decided her before she had even fully finished thinking them through. And once she was decided, she did not waver from it for an instant, because there is a kind of certainty in a person that comes not from being told a thing by anyone, but from knowing deep in the marrow of the bone precisely what it is that you could not go on living with having failed to do. The town below had pitied her, and then it had mocked her, and it had all of it agreed among itself, over its warm suppers, that she was leading her own children down to a frozen grave. None of that counted for anything at all now, or rather it counted now in exactly the opposite direction. Because to sit warm and safe up here in her mountain and let those people go cold, now that she alone in all the valley had warmth to spare, would be to become at last the very thing they had accused her of being. A person who prized her own bitter vindication over the plain living lives of children who were not her own. We have to go down to them, she told Amos. And she was already turning back into the warm chamber, already reaching down her heaviest coat from its peg. We have warmth up here, and they have none left at all. And there are little ones down in that town. And I will not sit up here warm inside this mountain and let them freeze in the dark. Amos caught her by the arm, not to stop her. She understood at once, but only to make her stop and truly think. You go down into that town, Mrs., and you show every soul in it that this mountain has kept you and yours warm as June, while their own proud houses failed and fell cold around them. And you will not only save them, he said, holding her eyes, you will shame them to the bone. Every last man who ever called you mad, you will make a plain fool of, standing there in the cold ruin of his own certainty. Cyrus Bellwether first among the whole lot of them. And folk do not always love the one who saves them, Mrs. If the saving of them costs them their pride into the bargain. You go down there now, and you will carry back up this mountain a good deal more than ever you brought down it. She knew that he was right. She knew, too, that it changed nothing at all in her. Then I will carry it, she said simply. A man's pride is a far lighter thing than a child's life, Amos. I will not weigh the one against the other and come out standing on the wrong side of it. She could not take her own children down into that broken and killing cold, and so it was quickly settled between them that Amos would stay behind with them in the warm chamber, while Verena went down the mountain alone, and she watched the argument rise up hot in the old man's eyes and then watched him swallow it back down, because he knew as well as she did herself that the children could be left with no other soul on the mountain, and that she was the younger and the stronger of the two of them for the breaking of a trail. She kissed Pearl's warm forehead and took Silas hard by both his shoulders, and told him plainly that he was to mind Amos in all things, and keep the fire exactly as she had shown him, and the boy nodded up at her with a grave seriousness that broke her heart clean in two, and mended it again in the very same beat. And then she wrapped herself against the killing air and went out into the blue-shadowed waste, breaking a trail down a mountain that had spent 3 days and nights trying its level best to kill every living thing upon it. The descent was the hardest single thing her body had ever done, harder by far than clearing the tunnel, harder than hauling all the stone, harder than any labor of that whole hard autumn. The snow lay waist-deep and treacherous, hiding sudden drops and buried rock beneath its smooth blue skin, and the air was so brutally cold that it seared her lungs, raw with every breath she dragged in, and froze the very moisture of her own eyes to grit on the lashes. She went down a dozen times and more, plunging through a crust into a hidden hollow. She dug herself out each time with numb and clumsy hands, and she went on. And when at last she staggered down into the ruined edge of the town, the sight of it drove the very last of that cold and shameful satisfaction out of her forever, because there is no vindication anywhere to be found in the sight of children's faces gone pinched and gray with cold, in families huddled together in the single room they had managed to keep from freezing solid, in the smoke-blackened desperation of good people who had burned their own furniture, stick by stick, to buy themselves one more night of life, and had very nearly run clean out of things left to burn. She went first to the houses that showed no smoke at all, because those were the ones the cold had already conquered, and in the third such house she came to, she found a young mother she knew a little by sight, Ellen Cobb, with a baby at her breast and a boy of 5 at her side, in a front room where the last of the fire had died down to gray ash, and the frost had begun to climb the inside of the walls in feathers of white. The little boy had gone quiet, and still against his mother, chilled through and heavy with a drowsiness that frightened Verena far more than any amount of crying ever could have. And Ellen had wrapped her own body clean around the child, and given him every last scrap of her own failing warmth, and had almost nothing left now in her to give. How long since the fire went out, Verena was already moving as she asked it, already stripping off her own outer coat to bundle the boy up inside it, already gathering the small chilled child up against the residual heat of her own body, because she knew, thank God in his heaven she knew, exactly what a cold child needed, and exactly how a body went about giving it to him. Ellen, look at me now. How long since before the dawn? Ellen's voice was worn down to a bare thread. We burned the cradle, the chairs, everyone. There is nothing left. There is nothing more to. He is not lost, Ellen. Do you hear me plain? He is deep cold, but he is not lost to us, and cold is a thing that we can undo between us. She had the boy held close against her chest now, tucked inside her own coat, sharing over to him the deep, patient heat her body had carried all the way down from the mountain, and she rubbed his small back through the layers with a firm and steady pressure. Not the frantic, hard chafing that could do a chilled child real harm, but the slow and patient warming she had learned at the sides of her own 2 little ones. We bring him back slow. Warm hands, warm body against him. No fire near him yet. Slow and steady and sure. That is the way of it. That is exactly the way. She looked up and met the terrified mother's eyes and made her own voice into the roof, the steady calm that a frightened soul could shelter itself beneath. I have a place that is warm, Ellen, warmer than any fire left burning in this whole valley, and I am going to carry every last one of you to it. But first we bring him back, right here, the two of us together, slow and warm. Talk to him now. Let him hear his mother's voice calling him back. It was not a fast thing, and it was not for a long stretch a certain one. And there was a run of minutes there in that frozen front room that Verena would carry with her to the very end of her days. The small boy so still against her chest. The mother's low broken pleading, the frost creeping ever higher up the wall. But warmth is the oldest medicine there is in all the world, older than any other. And the deep, patient heat she had carried down the mountain in the very core of her own body did the slow work that a roaring fire could never have done safely. And, slowly, by degrees, the boy came back. His small fingers moved first, curling and uncurling against her collarbone. Then there came a whimper out of him, thin and cross and beautifully, achingly alive. The sound of a small child who has decided he is deeply put out at being so disturbed. And Ellen Cobb made a sound that was not quite a word, and pressed her wet face hard against her son's slowly warming cheek. And Verena felt her own eyes at last spill over. There in the frozen ruin of the little room, holding close a living child who had been so very nearly lost to the cold, and was not lost after all. He is going to be all right, she said, and she believed it fully now, felt the truth of it in the returning warmth of the small body, and in the strengthening cross-complaint of his cry. He will be tired for a good while, and he will need slow warmth and something warm to eat, but he is going to be all right. Little ones come back from the cold far better than grown folk do, if only you catch them in time. And we caught him, Ellen. We caught him in time. She wrapped the boy tighter still and rose to her feet with him held secure against her, his mother clutching the baby close to her breast. Now, can you walk? Because I am not leaving one single soul in this house to freeze here tonight, and I have got a mountain up above us that will hold every last one of you warm as a morning in June. Word of it spread out through the broken town, the way warmth itself spreads through a cold room, slow at the first of it and then, all at once, everywhere. The mad Marsh widow had come down out of her hole in the mountain, they said one to another, and she had brought a near-frozen child back to himself with the warmth of her own body. And she was telling anyone who would stop and listen that there was a place up on the north shoulder warmer than any house left standing in all of Bounty Hollow, and that there was room enough in it for all, and that no soul who came to it would be turned away into the cold. Some did not believe a word of it. Some, too proud even now, or too badly frightened to move, would not leave the frozen ruins of their own homes even for the plain promise of warmth. But others came, the ones with little children, mostly, the ones who had burned the last of what they had, and had nothing left in all the world to lose but their own stubborn doubt. And they gathered up their little ones and what few blankets remained to them, and they followed the widow. They had so lately mocked up a trail that she broke open for them through the waist-deep snow, climbing toward a warmth they could not yet imagine and did not yet dare to believe in. Cyrus Bellwether was not among the souls who followed her. Verena learned it as she gathered the willing families at the foot of the trail, learned that the great fine house at the very center of the town had held out longest of them all against the cold, that its master had burned his good furniture and his fine seasoned oak, stick by stick, and had kept his wife and his two daughters alive through 3 days no house had any business, surviving by main strength and stubborn ceaseless labor, and that the house was failing him now, regardless of any of it, the cold winning it back by cruel inches, no matter how hard the man fought, and that Cyrus Bellwether had that very morning gone walking out into the frozen waste on foot, telling his wife that he was going for help, though every soul who heard of it knew full well there was no help to be found anywhere in all the valley, and that the man was not truly going for any help at all. He was going up the mountain. He was going, Verena understood with a certainty that lifted the fine hairs along her arms, up to the widow's hole, up to Emmett's folly, up to the very place he had stood on her porch and condemned as a damp, frozen tomb, and had forbidden his own millmen to lift a single hand to help her build because some part of the proud master builder could no longer bear. the not knowing of what his certainty had cost. Whether the woman and the two children he had written off for dead were already frozen and still in the ground where he had told them plainly they would end. He was climbing his hard way up the mountain to stand and face the grave he believed, with his whole heart, that he had helped to dig. And he did not know, he could not possibly know, breaking his way up through the deep drifts with his lungs on fire and his old guilt riding his back like a second storm, that the thin smoke he was climbing so grimly toward was not the smoke of the dead at all, but a thing he still believed flatly impossible, and that the tomb he was climbing up to mourn over was in truth the warmest and the most alive place in all the frozen valley, and that the very woman he had condemned to it had already gone down the far side of that same mountain to save the lives of the town that had stood by and let him do the condemning. Verena, down at the foot of the trail gathering her shivering column of families to her, did not yet know that Bellwether was somewhere above her on the mountain rather than somewhere below her in the town. That even at that moment, he was fighting his slow way up toward a warm chamber that held only old Amos and her own two children, that the hard reckoning she had braced her whole heart to carry back up the mountain was instead going to come down and meet her somewhere on the trail. She knew only that the low winter light was already beginning to slant toward the terrible clear cold of the coming night, that she had better than a dozen frightened and failing souls to move up a treacherous buried trail before the dark came down on them all, that somewhere high above her a warmth her husband had died, reaching out for, was waiting at last to prove every certain voice in the whole valley wrong. She settled Ellen Cobb's warming, crossly complaining boy more securely into the crook of her arm, and she turned her face up to the mountain, and she began the long, hard climb back up toward everything that was about to change. Cyrus Bellwether had stopped believing in his own two legs somewhere below the tree line, and still, somehow, they carried him upward, because a man driven on by guilt does not in the end walk on muscle alone. The drifts came to his waist in the open stretches and to his chest in the deep hollows, and every single step was a small private war that he won only by flatly refusing to consider the losing of it. And the cold had carried him past pain now into a strange, bright and floating clarity that some deep animal part of him distrusted, even as the representatives of him leaned gratefully upon it. He had built the better half of every standing structure in this whole valley with his own hands. He had stood on this woman's own sagging porch and told her to her face that her plan was nothing but a grave she was digging for her own babies. That certainty had rolled off his tongue that day with the full and settled weight of 40 years of true joints and plumb-hung walls behind every word of it. And now the memory of the saying of it sat lodged in him like a swallowed coal that would not cool. And he climbed on up toward the place where he fully expected to find the cold and silent proof of exactly what his certainty had cost. The ruined cabin came up first out of the blowing haze. Its roof caved clean and under the storm's terrible tonnage, a dead black broken shape against the blue-shadowed white of the snow, and the sight of it stopped him dead where he stood. There was no smoke at all rising from its chimney. There was no light in what little remained of its single window. There was only the absolute arrested stillness of a place that the cold had long since finished its work with. And Bellwether's heart went straight down into the snow at his feet because he had climbed up here to find them. And instead he had found only this, a collapsed and abandoned shell with the winter blowing clean through the heart of it, and every hard word he had spoken on that porch back in the bright autumn came flooding back all at once to stand and accuse him. He forced his way through the drift to the broken door. He put his shoulder to the packed snow that blocked it and shoved until the whole thing gave way inward with a groan, and he stood in the wreck of the single room, with the snow sifting down soft through the ruined roof onto a floor, gone white and abandoned. And he understood that he had been right in the very cruelest way that a man can ever be right about anything. He sank down against the splintered frame of the door. The bright floating clarity in his head had begun to feel a great deal less like clarity now, and a great deal more like the last of the warmth, quietly leaving his body. And he found that he did not greatly care. He had climbed all this way up to face the ghosts of his own stubborn making, and he had faced them now, and the facing of them had hollowed him out clean from the inside. It was in that emptied and defeated moment, staring dully out through the collapsed wall at the featureless white waste beyond the dead cabin, that he saw the thing his mind refused for a long, slow moment to accept as real. Out past the ruin, farther up the north shoulder where the old prospect scar cut back into the rock, the very air above the frozen ground was moving. It was not smoke. Smoke rose gray and drifted off sideways and thinned away to nothing. This was a shimmer, a trembling, wavering distortion in the freezing air, the very rising up a man sees hanging above a sunstruck road in the dead heat of July. And it was climbing up out of the frozen earth itself, in the dead cold heart of the coldest afternoon the valley had ever known. Bellwether pushed himself back up off the doorframe and stumbled toward it through the drifts. And with every floundering step, his mind built him a fresh reason to disbelieve his own two eyes. A trick of exhaustion. A phantom conjured up out of a guilty and half-frozen brain. The old prospect hole came clear before him, its low mouth dug out and kept open, where the storm should, by every right, have sealed it over solid. And from the dark throat of it there came a breath he felt against his raw face. From 10 full feet away, a slow and impossible exhalation of gentle warmth, rolling steadily out into the killing cold of the day. He fell to his knees in the snow at the very entrance of it. He put his bare hand flat against the rock beside the opening, and the stone was not cold. The stone was warm, warm as the living flank of some great sleeping animal, and the master builder of all Bounty Hollow knelt there in the deep snow, with his bare hand pressed flat to the impossible warmth of it, and felt the whole proud architecture of his life's certainty crack straight down its center. He crawled inside because his legs would no longer bear him up, and because the warmth drew him on the way that air draws a drowning man up, toward the surface of the water, 10 feet in, and the wind that had screamed at his back for hours upon hours simply ceased, cut off clean, as though a heavy door had once swung shut on the whole of the storm behind him. 20 feet in, and the brutal cold that had ridden his shoulders all the way up the mountain loosened its grip and began to fall away. 30 feet, and he began to feel it in true earnest, not the scorching one-sided blast of an iron stove, but a heat that came at him from every side at once, up from the floor, out from the glittering walls, down from the very air itself, folding gently around his frozen body the way warm water folds around. A man eased down into a bath. He rounded a slight bend in the passage on his hands and his knees, and the sight that opened up before him in the golden light broke something in the man that had stood rigid and unbending his whole life long. There was lamplight, soft and steady and golden. There was a widened chamber that was not a cave at all but a room, with a plank floor and a rough table and low beds, heaped with blankets that no soul in it had any need to huddle beneath. There was the good warm smell of fresh baked bread thick in the still air. Two small children sat on the floor of it in their shirt sleeves, a boy and a little girl, moving carved wooden figures through the quiet paces of some game between them, their cheeks flushed pink with sleep and warmth, and back by the great dark mass of a hearth at the rear of the room an old man he half knew, for Amos Hartwell was setting a covered pot down into a warm niche in the stone. No fire at all burned in the hearth. The children were not cold. The children were warm as a morning in June. In the dead frozen center of the storm's cruelest afternoon, in the very tomb that Cyrus Bellwether had condemned with all the full weight and authority of his trade. And the master builder knelt there in the entrance of it, with the snow melting off his shoulders in dark running rivulets, and could not force a single word up out of his ruined throat. Amos straightened up slowly from the hearth, one hand going to the small of his aching back, and his pale eyes found the frozen kneeling shape at the ragged edge of the lamplight. And there was no surprise at all in his weathered old face. Only a kind of grim and settled completion, as though he had been waiting through all 3 days of the storm for exactly this one man to come and arrive at exactly this understanding. He did not hurry himself to help him up. He let Bellwether kneel there a long moment in the full and crushing weight of what he was seeing with his own eyes. Because there are some lessons in this life that cannot be taught to a man at all, but only survived. Then the old mason crossed the warm chamber, took the bigger man under the arm with a wiry strength that surprised in one so old and spare, and drew him fully in out of the cold. "Sit yourself down against the stone, Cyrus," Amos said, guiding him down to lean against the warm brick that was quietly doing the very thing no iron in all the valley could do. "It will thaw you through better than any open fire ever could, and it will do it slow, without cracking the skin off your bones. You have come a hard and a long way up this mountain to learn a simple thing." He crouched stiffly down before the stricken man and studied his gray face with the unsentimental attention of someone checking hard for the deep and killing cold. "You are not gone. You are bad off, but you are not gone. What you are feeling now is the thaw coming into you, not the freeze. Let it come on slow." The boy had risen up from his game and come to stand a little way off, watching the strange broken man with the same grave and assessing calm that his mother had worked so long to put into him. And it was he who spoke first, in the plain and unafraid voice of a child, stating a thing that is simply true. "You are Mr. Bellwether," he said. "You told my mama that the cabin would kill us. There was no accusation anywhere in it, only the plain observation, which was somehow a great deal worse to bear than any accusation could have been. It near killed you instead. But the mountain will not let it. My mama said so." Whatever had remained standing of the master builder's composure went straight out of the man then. He had condemned this very child to a cold death, with the whole full confidence of his life's expertise behind him. And the child had just now offered him, without a trace of malice anywhere in it, the plain shelter of the very warmth that Bellwether had sworn on his own authority could not exist in the world. He pressed the heels of his two frozen hands hard against his eyes, and his broad shoulders shook. And the sound that at last came up and out of him was not a sound that any man down at the mill would ever have believed could come from Cyrus Bellwether. Amos let it run its full course out of him. He had seen strong and rigid men break before in his long life, and he knew a thing about it that few others did. That a thing built too rigid does not bend when at last it fails but shatters instead. And that the shattering of it is only ever the true beginning of whatever the man may yet choose to become afterward. Verena came up out of the blinding snow and into the mouth of her own home with Ellen Cobb's warming boy still bundled tight against her chest, and a straggling, exhausted column of half-frozen families laboring up the broken trail behind her, and she stopped dead in the entrance at the sight of the man weeping against her hearth. She had braced her whole heart, on the long climb back up, to carry the town's wounded pride up this mountain, along with its cold and failing bodies. She had not once braced it for this, for Cyrus Bellwether, brought down to a shaking, thawing wreck of himself, in the golden light of the very place he had so proudly cursed, and the sight of him drove clean out of her whatever hard word she had been holding ready. There is no satisfaction anywhere to be found, she discovered in that one still instant, in the ruin of a man who has already ruined himself so completely in his own eyes. Whatever score she might once have thought to settle with him had gone and settled itself, and it had left behind it nothing at all that was worth the collecting. He lifted his wet face up from his hands when her shadow fell across the lamplight, and he saw her standing there in the entrance, caked white with ice, and holding another woman's saved child safe against her. And the last of his voice came back to him, raw and broken all to pieces. "I told you it would be a tomb." He got the words out like stones dragged one by one over gravel. "I stood on your own porch, and I told you to your face that this hole in the ground would be your children's grave, and I forbade my own men to lift so much as one hand to help you, and I made the whole valley take up the word and call you mad." His hand moved of its own accord against the warm rock at his side, disbelieving it even now, even with the full and living proof of it, holding the whole killing cold at bay all around him. "And you came down off this mountain and into my town while I was climbing up it to bury you. And here you stand in your own doorway with another woman's saved child in your arms. How? In God's own name, missus. How? Verena crossed the warm chamber and knelt first to pass the drowsy cob boy over into Amos's careful waiting hands, because a child came first, always and everywhere, before any reckoning between grown people could be had. Only then did she straighten back up and look down at the broken master builder, and when at last she spoke, there was no triumph anywhere in her voice, no returning to him of the humiliation he had once dealt her. Only the quiet, settled weight of a thing she had learned down in the dark and the cold and was now handing across to him plainly. You tried to fight the winter, Mr. Bellwether. She unwound the frozen scarf slowly from about her throat, her breath still coming hard and ragged from the long climb. You met it with iron and with oak and with good tight walls, and you fought it with every single thing that you had in you, and it beat you down all the same, because you cannot ever beat it, and no soul living can. I did not fight it at all. I asked the mountain instead to keep us, and the mountain kept us. She looked past him then to the great banked hearth that had held its warmth faithful through 3 full days without once faltering, to the warm granite face that had never in all its long ages once been cold. Your stove shouts its heat out into the air, and the wind steals every word of it away before it is even finished. My hearth tells its story down low to the stone, slow, all the long night through, and come the morning the stone still remembers every word. That is the whole of the secret. That is all of it there ever was. My Emmett found it, and it cost him his life before ever he could tell a living soul of it, but one old man the town had already thrown away. And I have only finished the thing that my husband started for us. The families were crowding in through the entrance behind her. Now, mothers with babes in arms, old couples leaning hard on one another, children struck silent with wonder at the impossible warmth, after 3 days of unending shivering, and the widened room that had once held only her own small family began to fill with the low, astonished murmur of people who could not credit what their own skin was telling them was true. Bellwether watched them come, streaming in out of the cold. He had been so entirely certain was unanswerable by any hand, watched them shed their frost and their fear alike against the deep warmth of the stone. And something in the man's ruined face traveled slowly from breaking towards something harder by far to put a name to, the look of a man watching every fixed and guiding star of his whole understanding of the world rearrange itself in the sky above him in the space of a single hour. His head came up sharp then, all at once, as though a hand had struck him across the face. Adele. The name tore its way out of him. My wife, my girls. I left them down in the house. I told them I was going for help. There was no help. The house was already failing when I left it, the frost climbing up the inside of the walls. And he tried to force his own feet under him and could not, his frozen legs betraying him utterly. And the raw panic that flared up in his eyes was the pure, undiluted terror of a man who has that very instant remembered the thing he abandoned. I have to go back down. I have to go back down for them, now, I have to. Verena's hand came down, firm on his shoulder, and pressed him back against the warm rock before he could ruin himself trying to rise. You will not make it 10 steps back out on those legs, and you will do them no good at all frozen dead in a drift halfway down the mountain, she said, and there was no unkindness in it, only hard sense. She turned, already scanning the faces of the men who had come up the trail strong enough to have made the climb with something left in them, and her voice took on the flat, clear command of a woman who has stopped asking anyone for anything and started deciding. Tom Alder, Redfern. The two of you came up this trail with strength to spare. My husband kept a sledge in the lean-to behind the cabin, and there are blankets here, warm ones, warmed clear through to the core by the stone. We go down together, and we go fast, while there is still light left in the sky, and we bring the whole Bellwether family back up here before the true cold comes down on this valley tonight. She looked back down at the stricken man at her feet. Your girls will not freeze in that house, Cyrus. Not while there is warmth to spare on this mountain and legs left to carry it down to them. You have my word on it, and I am not a woman who spends her word lightly. She would not let him come with them, and somewhere beneath his terror, he understood that she was right, that in his state he would be far more danger to the rescue than any aid to it. And he let Amos hold him there by the warm hearth while the very widow he had condemned went back out into the killing cold a second time in the one day, now to save the family of the man who had tried harder than any other soul in the valley to break her. Two of the millmen went down at her side, shamed into strength by the plain sight of her going. And they took up the warmed blankets and the recovered sledge, and they broke back down the trail at a pace that punished them all, racing the failing light down into the broken town, to the great fine house at its center where the cold had so very nearly finished the work the storm began. They found Adele Bellwether in the one room she had managed to hold against the freeze, her body wrapped clean around her two daughters beneath the last of the household's blankets. The fire long since dead, the frost sheeting the inner walls in feathers of white, her own strength very nearly spent to its end from the long hours of keeping the girls warm with her own body while her husband was gone. She had burned the kitchen chairs. She had burned the dresser drawers one by one. She had done every last thing that a mother does. And it had not been enough against a cold the likes of this one. And she looked up at the widow bursting in through her door with the dazed and disbelieving eyes of a woman who had already stopped letting herself expect any rescue at all. The two girls were cold, chilled, and gone drowsy in the dangerous way. But they were not lost, and Verena knew the plain difference on sight now, the very way she had known it in the Cobb house, and she moved without one wasted motion in her. Warm blankets, warmed clear through, wrapped them close, no fire near them yet. She was already bundling the smaller of the two girls into the deep heat the stone had put into the wool, already pressing the warmth of it in against the child the way the mountain had taught her to. Adele, wrap the older one just so, held against your own body inside the warm blanket. And we carry them both up on the sledge together, slow and steady, sharing out the warmth between them. They are chilled, not beyond us. Do you hear me now? Chilled we can undo, the two of us. We caught them in good time, the same as I caught the cob boy this day, the same as the mountain caught my own. She got the failing mother up, and moving through the sheer contagious force of her own certainty, and between the two of them they had both girls, swaddled deep in the warmed wool, and settled onto the sledge in the space of a few minutes. And the men took up the ropes, and they turned the whole precious burden of it back toward the mountain and the only warmth left alive in all the world. The climb back up in the very last of the failing daylight was a thing Verena would carry with her all the rest of her days. The 2 mill men hauling hard at the sledge with its swaddled girls, Adele stumbling along at its side with one hand always upon her children, the widow herself breaking the trail out ahead of them all into the deepening blue of the coming night, and the cold pressing down harder and harder with every foot the sun dropped behind the peaks. The clear killing cold that Amos had promised would come following on the heels of the storm. They made the tunnel mouth just as the first hard white stars came out in a sky gone black, and they carried the two girls in out of the death of that night and into the living warmth of the stone, and Verena watched Cyrus Bellwether, still too weak in the legs to stand, reach out from his place against the hearth as his daughters were brought in to him and gather them both against his chest, warm and drowsy and complaining now at being so jostled about alive, every one of them alive, and she turned herself away then to give the family that moment to themselves, because there are some things a body ought to be let feel without any stranger standing witness to it. By full dark, the chamber that Bellwether had once stood and named a burrow fit only for animals held near 30 living souls within it, and it held them all in a deep and comfortable, even warmth. While outside its stone the temperature fell away past anything the oldest man among them had ever in his long life felt, the clear sky cold that comes down after a great storm, to collect whatever the storm itself left behind it. Verena moved among them all with fresh bread from the hearthstone oven and a thin soup stretched wide to feed a crowd, and she felt the very last of the town's old hard judgment dissolve away in the warm air, not because anyone's soul stood and declared it dissolved, but because you simply cannot go on calling a woman mad to her face while you are sheltering your own children from a certain death inside the very madness you once condemned. Ellen Cobb sat with her recovered boy, asleep across her lap, and could not seem to stop watching the widow's moving face. The millmen who had hauled the sledge sat close by the warm granite and spoke of it low among themselves, running their rough hands wonderingly over the rock, unable to leave off marveling at it. And Cyrus Bellwether, his two daughters, at last warm and safe against him, watched Verena work among his neighbors, with an expression that had traveled clean past shame into something it would take the man, the rest of his life, to fully learn the name of. "How does a man go on and live?" he said quietly, when she brought him at last a warm cup of the coffee dregs, with having been so entirely certain, and so entirely wrong, and having very near cost so many good souls their lives for it. She crouched down beside him, and she gave the question the full serious weight that it was owed, because it was not a small one he was asking, and he was not asking it lightly of her. "The same way that anyone goes on and lives with anything at all," she told him. "You let it change you, or else you let it break you, and only you yourself ever get the choosing of which. The being wrong is not the sin of it, Mr. Bellwether. Every soul alive is wrong, all the day long, about 100 different things. The sin of it is being so deep in love with your own certainty that you would sooner stand and watch good people freeze than ever. Once admit that the ground beneath your feet might know a thing that you do not." She rose back up, her knees popping from the long day's hard punishment. "You have got a chance now that most men never once get in their lives. You watched your own certainty fail you with your own two eyes, and you lived through it, and every last soul that you love lived through it too. Do something with that. Do not go and waste it grieving over the words that you can never now unspeak." The night held, and the mountain held, and one by one, the sheltered families sank down into the first, true, and untroubled sleep any of them had known in 3 long days, warm and safe together in the deep belly of the rock, while the very coldest night in the whole valley's memory spent itself out uselessly against 60 feet of patient stone. Verena did not sleep. She sat on by the hearth, with Pearl curled warm against her side, and Silas dozing near on his planks. And she kept the low watch that a mother keeps. And somewhere in the small hours, Amos eased himself stiffly down beside her with all his old joints, protesting the movement. And the two of them sat together, in the golden dimness, listening to the slow breathing of 30 rescued souls. "You know that it does not end with the storm," the old mason said at last, pitching his voice low for her ears alone. "That surveyor did not ride back down this mountain, only to forget what it was he saw up here. Pruitt knew there was something up here worth the having before ever you cleared out that tunnel, and now his own man is carried back down. Proof of it. Proof that the widow he fully expected to freeze right out of the country is instead sitting warm as toast on the very thing his company means to have. A man the likes of that does not just back off and let it lie. He comes on harder. And he comes on with lawyers, and lawyers' misses are a colder thing by far than any storm that ever blew." Verena had known it deep in her bones since the night Chase Renwick lay sleeping by her fire with his traveling eyes fixed on the warm rock. But hearing Amos say the whole of it out plain settled the knowledge in her into something she could take up and act upon. "Then he will find that I finished a good deal more of my husband's work than only a hearth," she said, watching the low red coals. "Emmett was the most careful man I ever knew in all my life. He measured a thing twice and 3 times over before ever he cut it the once, in his work and in his living both. If he found something up here on this mountain, worth a whole company sending its men up to freeze for, then he did not leave it lying about loose for the first grasping hand to take. He will have set it down or safe, and filed it, and protected it, the same careful way he protected every other thing he ever loved in this world. I have only got to find out where." The storm's long grip finally broke for good 3 days on the deep cold, easing at last enough that the sheltered families could begin making their careful way back down the mountain to dig out what the winter had left. standing of their homes, and the town they came back down to was not at all the same town that had climbed up the mountain to shelter. Bounty Hollow had lost 3 cabins out on its edges to the crushing weight of the snow, and better than a dozen of its people carried the marks of frostbite that would trouble them for years to come, and every last soul in the valley now knew, with the hard, unarguable knowledge of the survived, that the only shelter in the whole country that had held firm through the very worst of it was the one the master builder had stood and condemned, and the whole laughing town had mocked. The pity was gone from them now. The mockery was gone. What had risen up to take their place, in the careful halting way of proud people who have been proven wrong to their faces, was something nearer to awe, and beneath the awe a single question that now hung over the whole of the valley like smoke. How had she done it? And could the thing be done again? For all of them? Cyrus Bellwether answered that question with the whole fierce energy of a convert. He came back up the mountain the very first morning the trail could be broken open, not with the old certainty he had carried up it before, but with a notebook and a measuring tape in his hands, and the plain humility of a man beginning a fresh apprenticeship at 55 years of age. And he asked the widow's leave to study the working of the hearth, and she gave it to him freely, and she watched the proud master builder of all Bounty Hollow kneel himself down at the feet of old forgotten Amos Hartwell and beg to be taught the craft the town had let quietly die out at the ragged edges of its own memory. Amos, who had waited a lifetime of 60 years for a single fire worth the teaching, found himself all at once with 2 eager pupils and a purpose, and the change that it worked in the forgotten old man was a thing worth standing and watching. His bent spine straightening by the day, his ruined hands moving sure and proud once more as he explained the winding secret of the smoke passages and the deep banking of heat in stone to the very men whose fast-milled lumber had once made his slow craft obsolete. But Verena did not join herself to the lessons at the hearth, because she had a different search entirely to be about, and it consumed her whole through those first thawing days. She went back through Emmett's crate of journals, not reading them now for the secret of the hearth, which she had already long since wrung out of their pages, but hunting hard through them for the second thing, the careful record she felt certain in her heart her husband had left somewhere of exactly what it was he had found down in the rock. She read every last marginal note in his hand. She held the pages up close to the lamp, searching for anything at all pressed faint and secret into the paper. She found survey after patient survey, temperature readings taken down at the tunnel's deep face across the turning of a whole year, careful and repeated and methodical, a scientist quietly documenting an anomaly he did not yet himself fully understand. But she did not find the one thing that she truly needed, the hard proof that would stand up in the light against a land company's paid lawyers, and her worry grew heavier in her with every journal she closed and set aside. It was Silas, in the end of it, who found the thing, and the finding of it changed the whole shape of everything that came after. The boy had taken to sitting close by his father's beloved journals, while his mother searched them, turning the pages over with a reverence that was half remembering and half pure hope. And one evening he came to her, holding the working geology book open to a page near its very back, his young face drawn up in a puzzle. "Mama, why did Papa go and draw the tunnel out twice?" He pointed one small finger down at a careful cross-section of the prospect hole, and then across to a second, fainter sketch of the very same passage on the facing page, drawn out to a different scale, with a small square inked in at the 60-foot mark, where no square had any business being at all. "This one here has got a little box drawn into the wall of it. But there is no box in our wall. I have looked and looked for it." Verena took the journal from his hands with fingers that had gone very still and careful. The second sketch was no survey at all. It was a map, cleverly disguised as only one more geological diagram among the hundreds of them, and it showed a place in the granite face at the very back of the widened chamber, where Emmett had cut a hidden cavity into the living rock, and then sealed it over, a hiding place no eye on earth would ever find, that did not already know precisely to look for it, marked out in a private code that only his own family would ever have any cause to read. She carried a lamp to the back wall that same night, and she ran her fingertips over the warm granite inch by careful inch at the exact height the sketch had marked, pressing and searching, until at last, beneath a shelf of stone that looked no different in the world from any other, her fingers found the fine hairline seam of a fitted plug of rock, mortared home so cleverly and so well that it had passed for solid granite through all her long weeks of living, and sleeping right up against it. She worked it loose with a chisel by lamplight while Amos held the lamp steady, and Bellwether steadied her working hand. The three of them crowded together at the back of the warm chamber, and behind the plug of stone there lay a cavity lined carefully with oiled cloth, and folded within the cloth there lay a flat tin case, and sealed within the case there lay the whole of what her husband had died before ever he could give to her. There was a document under the raised seal of the Federal Land Office, a patent granting clear and permanent and unbreakable title to the whole claim, filed and recorded and set beyond any dispute, and it was drawn in the name of Verena Marsh, her own self. For Emmett had put the land in her name, and not in his, so that no misfortune that ever came to him could take his wife's ground out from under her feet. There was a second document folded beside it, a formal witnessed record of the geothermal spring and its survey dated and signed, establishing beyond the reach of any lawyer's clever argument that the warmth down in the rock had been discovered and documented and lawfully claimed by the Marsh family whole years before any company of the East had ever once set its eyes upon the valley. And there was a letter. She knew his hand upon the folded page before ever she opened it. She had to lower herself down to sit on the warm plank floor before she could read a word of it. And Amos quietly drew Bellwether away, toward the hearth, to give her the moment alone. Because a letter come from the hand of the dead is a thing a woman ought, by rights, to meet by herself the first time. Emmett had written it. She understood, as she read on, in the last free week of his life, in the first bright flush of the great hopeful thing he had found, and had not yet had the time given him to build. And he had sealed it away here against the one small and careful possibility that a careful man always allows room for in his reckonings, the possibility that he might not, in the end, be given the chance to tell her of it himself. "My dearest Verena," it began, and her eyes blurred at once. "If you are reading this, then the mountain has done to me the thing that mountains will sometimes do to the men who love them too well, and I am sorry. More sorry than this poor letter has room to hold, to have gone and left you and the little ones all alone. But listen to me now, my love, for this is the whole of it. I have found something up in the old prospect hole. There is a warmth living in the rock at the back of it, real and constant and never failing. A gift the patient earth has been holding here in trust for far longer than there have been men in this valley to find it. I have measured it careful through a full turning year, and it does not fail with the season. Build there, Verena. Take the children down into the mountain and let it keep you warm. In the way I have copied out for you whole in grandfather's old journals, the way the lost craft teaches. They will laugh at you for it, every soul in the valley. Let them laugh their fill. The claim is yours, filed clean and clear in your own name, and the witnessed record of the warmth is sealed here beside this letter, so that no grasping man alive may ever take from you and the children the thing that I have found for you. I always did know that you were the strong one of the two of us. I always knew, deep down, that if ever it came to it, you would be the one to finish the thing that I could only begin. Keep them warm, my love. Keep them warm through all the long winters, and know, wherever I have gone on to, that I trusted you with every last thing I had in the world, because you were the only soul I ever met that I truly could." She read it through 3 times over before she could see the page clear again through her tears. And when at last she looked up from it, the great banked hearth swam and shimmered gold in her wet eyes. And she understood at last the full and final measure of the thing her husband had done for her. He had not left her a folly. He had not left her a widow's desperate gamble, nor a dead man's failed and foolish dream. He had left her a whole fortune of warmth, and a clear lawful title to hold it safe, and a letter of such complete and such unwavering faith in her that it reached clean across the cold gulf of death itself to tell her she had been right all along to believe that the small quiet voice she had chosen to follow against the whole loud and reasonable chorus of the valley had been, in truth, his own voice all the while, waiting there patient in the rock for her to come and find it. The proud town had buried his great gift under the name of a fool's folly. She had dug it back up out of the dark with her own two bleeding hands, and it had saved not only her own two children, but the better half of the valley besides. And now it lay here at last in her lap, sealed and lawful and set forever beyond the reach of any grasping company that might come down the road for it. That reach was not long in the coming. Horace Pruett rode into Bounty Hollow. Within the fortnight, the very moment the roads had cleared enough to bear the weight of a carriage, and he did not come as a man come to bargain over a thing. He came as a man come to collect a thing that he had already decided in his own mind was rightfully his, with Chase Renwick riding grim and silent at his side, and a leather case of documents beneath his arm that he plainly believed would settle the whole matter before ever it had properly begun. He found the widow Marsh not frozen out and desperate at last to sell, as his own surveyor had led him fully to expect, but standing instead at the very center of a town that now regarded her as something very near to its own savior, with the master builder himself, and better than half the millmen ranged in a quiet line at her back, and Horace Pruett's practiced smile faltered on his face for the first time as he read the room and understood all at once that the ground had shifted clean out from under his feet. He recovered it quickly because men the likes of Horace Pruett always do recover, and he laid his leather case down upon the counter of the general store where the whole of the town had gathered in, and he spread his documents out across it with the easy confidence of a man who believes he holds every winning card in the deck. "I have no wish at all to be unpleasant about this, Mrs.," he said, and the false warmth he poured into it turned her stomach where she stood. "But the plain fact of the matter is that the title to that claim was never once properly perfected. My company holds the original survey and the recording of it, and I am very much afraid that the paper you believe grants you that ground is founded upon a small error your late husband made in his filing. It happens out here. The frontier records are a sorry mess at the best of times. I have come all this way to make you a more than generous offer regardless, out of pure Christian charity given your sad circumstances, a good deal more than the barren land could ever be worth, and to spare us all the ugliness of the courts." He slid a single paper across the counter toward her. "You would be a wise woman to take it, and to be grateful for it. The alternative before you is a fight that you cannot possibly hope to win, against a company that can well afford to go on fighting it forever." Verena did not so much as touch the paper. She looked down at it a moment, and then she looked back up at the man himself. And when she spoke, her voice was so steady and so level that it made Chase Renwick, standing there grim behind his employer's shoulder, go visibly pale. "My husband did not make errors in his filings, Mr. Pruett," she said. "He was the most careful man that I have ever known, and he trusted no man's honesty 1 inch further than he could himself prove it, and least of all in all the world did he trust the honesty of a land company. So allow me to show you the ground you have ridden all this way to buy." She laid Emmett's flat tin case down upon the counter, beside Pruett's fine leather one, and she drew out the federal patent and the witnessed record of the spring, and she set them down open where the whole crowded room could plainly see them. "This is the patent, filed clean and clear in my own name, recorded whole in the federal office, and dated a full 3 years before ever your company heard so much as the name of Bounty Hollow spoken aloud. And this is the record of the warmth living in the rock, surveyed and witnessed and signed, the very thing your own surveyor there climbed up my mountain in a killing storm to steal himself a look at. My claim is not imperfect in the smallest degree. My claim is beyond any dispute in law, and I find that I would very much like to know just how it is that your documents there come to show a survey and a recording that the federal office has no honest way in the world of possessing. The question landed in the crowded store like a heavy stone dropped into a still pond, and the answer to it was written plain and stark across Chase Renwick's stricken face before ever Pruitt could get his own mouth open to speak. The young surveyor had gone from pale to a sick gray, and his eyes darted once, helplessly, toward the leather case. And every last soul in that room read in the single frightened flick of that glance the very thing Horace Pruitt had been counting his whole scheme upon no man ever being able to prove. Bellwether stepped forward then, the master builder, whose plain word had carried the settled weight of law in this valley for 40 long years. And he took up Pruitt's spread documents in his own hands and examined them close with the trained and unhurried eye of a man who had signed his own honest name to better than 1,000 true papers in his time. And his verdict, when he gave it, ended Horace Pruitt's afternoon, and a great deal more of the man besides. "These recordings are forged," Bellwether said flatly, turning the papers about so the whole room could see them for themselves. "The seal of the land office on them is wrong, plainly wrong, the wrong size of it, and the wrong wording entire, for the year it claims to have been drawn. I have filed enough true claims in my own life to know a clumsy counterfeit the moment one is put under my nose. This company did not come into our valley to buy up a claim it believed was worthless. It came to steal. A claim it knew full well was worth a fortune, and when the widow would not sell it cheap and frightened, it went and manufactured this paper here to scare her clean off her own lawful ground." He set the forgeries back down upon the counter with the plain contempt of an honest craftsman for shoddy and dishonest work. "There is a federal land office down in Denver, Mr. Pruitt, that takes an uncommon dim view of forged recordings. I believe they are going to want a long and a searching conversation with you about just how it is your company came by these." Pruitt's whole composure came apart at once and altogether. He grabbed for the forged papers on the counter, far too late now, 3 sworn witnesses having already read them over with their own eyes, and he rounded on Chase Renwick with a snarl that told the whole listening town a great deal more than any signed confession ever could have. "You were to make certain sure there was no clean title standing anywhere against us," he spat at the younger man. "You told me to my face the husband died before ever he perfected the filing of it." The ruinous words were out of his mouth and hanging in the warm air of the store before the man understood that he had just now hanged himself with them in a room, packed full of witnesses, and the young surveyor recoiled back from him as from a snake. And in that one ugly naked exchange between the two of them, the very last of the company's whole case collapsed into open and public view. It was Chase Renwick who finished the thing, in the end, because Chase Renwick was young and badly frightened and had climbed a mountain in a killing storm and been saved from a cold death by the very woman his employer had sent him up it to ruin. And something of that mountain's deep warmth had been working slow on him in all the weeks since, the patient way the warm stone works upon cold things. "I will not go to a federal prison for your forgeries, Horace," he said, and his voice shook badly in him, but it held. "I told you plain there was smoke standing on that claim all the autumn long. I told you there was warmth living in the rock of it. You knew the land was worth a fortune to the company, and you had me draw up these false recordings so that you could take it. And I will tell the land office in Denver exactly that, in exactly those words, before ever I let you pin the whole of it on a dead man and his widow." He turned then to Verena, and the shame that stood raw and open in his young face was a real and a true thing. "I saw what it was you had built up there on that mountain, Mrs. I saw your own children sitting warm in the very dead middle of that storm. And I rode back down, and I told him it was a thing worth the having, and I have hated my own self for the doing of it every day since. I will set it right now. It is the only thing left that I can do that is worth anything at all." Horace Pruitt did not sell the claim, nor buy the claim, nor take one single warm stone of it away with him, because a company that will forge federal recordings to steal a lawful patent off a widow does not long survive the public discovery of the fact. The testimony went down the mountain to the land office in Denver, on Chase Renwick's own signature and on Cyrus Bellwether's sworn and respected word, and the federal investigation that came fast on the heels of it did not stop itself at the single forgery worked in Bounty Hollow. Because a man who has counterfeited the one recording has near always counterfeited a great many others, and the whole rotten architecture of the Pruitt Land and Mineral Company came crashing down under the sheer accumulated weight of its own long dishonesty. Pruitt faced at last the very courts he had so lately threatened Verena with. Only now they were stern federal courts, and he himself stood the defendant before them, and the whole grasping fortune he had built up over the years by taking valuable ground away from people too poor and too frightened to fight him for. It drained away into fines and into lawyers' fees, and at the very last into a long federal prison term. And the man who had ridden so grandly into the valley, certains, the widow would fold before him, rode back out of it in the hard custody of a federal marshal, having lost every last thing he came to take and a great deal more that he had long believed was safely and forever his. The greed that had sent one man up a mountain in a killing storm to lay a measuring tape against another family's warmth inherited in the end exactly what such greed always earns itself, and the whole valley stood and watched it happen to him, and drew from the watching that oldest and deepest of satisfactions, the sight of the arrogant and the grasping brought low at last by the very people they had counted on staying weak. If you have climbed all this way up the mountain alongside Verena, through the storm and the killing cold, and the long, slow uncovering of everything her husband left behind for her, then take just a moment now to subscribe to this channel. Because the part that comes next is the part these stories are truly and always about. The part where the very thing that everyone agreed to call a folly becomes at last the thing that saves them all. And tell me, down in the comments below, whether you have ever once held on hard to something the whole world was telling you to let go of, and lived to see it proven worth every day of the holding. I would dearly love to read it. The spring that came at last to Bounty Hollow that year came to a changed valley, and the change in it ran a great deal deeper than the simple melting of the snow. Cyrus Bellwether did not go back to raising the tight-sealed pine houses with their hungry iron stoves, because he had knelt down in the warm living heart of the mountain and could no longer make himself believe in the old way of it. And under his direction now, with Amos Hartwell standing at his side as the true master of the craft, and the widow Marsh consulted on every design, the people of Bounty Hollow began to build their homes differently. They dug them back into the south-facing hillsides, where the patient ground itself would help to keep them. They raised up great banked hearths of brick and stone in the center of everyone. Hearths that drank down the heat of a single bright fire and gave it back slow and faithful through the longest and blackest of nights. And they learned at last to work alongside the winter instead of squandering all their strength in the losing fight against it. They took to calling them marsh hearths, though Verena never once asked a soul to, and the name of them spread on down the valley and then clean beyond it, as travelers carried word of the strange warm town high up in the cold country that no winter could ever seem to touch. Amos Hartwell, who had been let drift so long out to the forgotten edges of the town's own memory, spent the last good years of his long life as the single most sought-after man in the whole county, teaching the deep banking of heat and stone to any soul with the humility left in him to learn it, his ruined hands gone sure and proud once more upon the brick, his lost craft alive again in the world and passing forward at last into younger hands that would go on to carry it long after he himself was gone from it. A man is never once truly poor. He took to saying in those good last years, so long as he holds fast to even one true thing that is worth the passing on. And by that plain measure, the old mason died the richest man in all the valley, with a full 100 warm hearths built true to his teaching, keeping families warm through hard winters he did not himself live to see come. Chase Renwick did not leave the valley when it was all of it over. There was nothing left anywhere for him to go back to. His employer disgraced and imprisoned, and his company dissolved. his own name saved out of the wreck of it. All, only by the hard truth he had at the last, found the courage to tell, and Verena, who might so easily have driven the young man out of the country with a single word against him, did not speak it. She had learned down in the tunnel that the deep cold changes a person, and she had learned since that the deep warmth changes a person too. And she chose to give the young man the plain chance to become the better thing his testimony had shown he still could be. He took up honest surveying under Cyrus Bellwether's own mentorship, filing true and careful claims now for the very sort of poor families the company would once have cheated without a second thought, and he made of all the rest of his long life a quiet and unshowy amends for the one cold ride he had made back down that mountain with another family's stolen warmth written down in his notebook. Verena Marsh never once grew rich in the way the grasping men of Pruitt's ruined company had understood the word riches, because she never for one moment thought of the warmth living down in her rock as a thing that was ever meant to be sold. The old spring beneath the granite was hers now by clean and unbreakable federal title, documented and lawful, and worth a genuine fortune to any company that might have come to strip and exploit it. And she left it lying exactly where her husband had first found it, keeping her own family and her neighbors warm through the winters, because some inheritances in this life are meant to be lived quietly inside of, and not ever spent. She raised Silas and Pearl up in the warm heart of the mountain, and they grew straight and strong in a home that no winter on earth could ever reach into. And she became, without ever once seeking after it, the quiet and unshakable foundation that the whole town came to lean its weight upon. People did not come up her mountain to ask her permission for things. They came up it to ask her advice. She would walk down to a new building site and run one hand slow over a freshly laid hearthstone and offer some small quiet suggestion. And it would be followed to the letter, because the very woman the valley had, once all agreed together to bury, in its mind had become in the end the one soul it trusted above all others to tell it how to live. The liability had become the landmark. The problem had become the answer. The mad widow in her hole in the frozen ground had become the whole reason that Bounty Hollow stood and endured, where a dozen prouder towns had not. Years and years later, long after Verena herself was gone from the world, and her two children had grown and scattered out across the country to raise up families of their own in warm houses built true to her teaching, newcomers to the strangely resilient old town would remark to one another on its unusual homes, on the great stone hearts of them, on the uncanny way they held their deep warmth through even the very fiercest winters in all that high cold country. And some old-timer of the place, perhaps a grandchild of Cyrus Bellwether himself, raised up from the cradle on the whole story of it, would take them out and up the north shoulder of the mountain to the low mouth of the old prospect hole, where the whole of it had first begun, and would show them the weathered journal that was kept there still against the warm stone, and would read out to them the final entry set down in it, penned first by a geologist who had understood the deep secrets of the earth, and then lived out true by the wife who finished the thing he had only begun. Wood gives fire, and fire is a shout that the wind can always steal away, it read, in a careful hand gone long faded. But stone gives warmth, and warmth is a story, and a story, once the patient stone has truly learned it, the stone will keep and hold forever. Always build for the story. And what about you, watching this now? Wherever it is that the warmth of your own house is tonight, holding back whatever cold it is that presses in against your own windows. What forgotten prospect hole waits even now somewhere out on your own ground, filled in and named a fool's folly by every soul who is so entirely certain they alone know the one and only way a thing can rightly be done? What quiet voice inside you have? You let yourself be talked clean out of trusting by the loud and the reasonable chorus of good people who have never once themselves dug down where you were, always told there was nothing at all to find. We are all of us handed, sooner or later in this life, some sealed and buried thing that the whole world has already agreed together to call worthless, and we are all of us told and often by the very people who love us best and mean us the most kindness, to simply let the thing go, and to build instead the same leaking walls that everyone else has always built against the same hard and coming winters. But somewhere down in the rock, beneath the very thing they told you to abandon, there may yet be a warmth that never quits, waiting patient through all the long years for someone at last grown stubborn enough to go and clear the choked entrance and crawl inside and lay one bare hand flat against the stone and feel it at last answer back. Your mountain is waiting on you still. The knowledge that you need may already lie buried on your own ground, in a journal that no one ever thought to teach you how to read, in a quiet voice you were told long ago to stop your listening to. Go now, and clear the entrance of it. What you find waiting there in the warm dark may just turn out to be the very thing that keeps every last soul you love. This story is a historically inspired reconstruction, its characters and its events created only to illustrate a principle, offered here for narrative and for entertainment purposes alone, and it is not in any way intended as engineering or architectural or survival advice. Always consult with qualified experts before ever undertaking any construction or shelter project of your own.